There is a moment in history so catastrophic, so complete, so absolute in its destruction, that archaeologists who first uncovered its evidence could barely bring themselves to believe what the soil was telling them. Not the fall of one empire, not the decline of one city, not the slow erosion of one culture across comfortable centuries. What happened between roughly 1,200 and 1,150 BC was something far more total than any of those things. Every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the great civilizations that had built palaces and navies and writing systems and trade networks spanning thousands of miles, collapsed. Not one of them, not a few of them, all of them, within the span of a single human lifetime. A world that had existed for centuries simply stopped existing. Cities that had stood for 500 years burned and were never rebuilt. Writing systems that had recorded everything from grain shipments to royal decrees vanished so completely that scholars would spend decades in the modern era struggling to even decode what those symbols had once meant. Trade routes that had connected Egypt to Anatolia, to Greece, to Mesopotamia, in an intricate breathing web of commerce, went quiet. And then the darkness came, a period historians sometimes call the Bronze Age Dark Ages, centuries of reduced population, lost technology, and silence in the archaeological record. Something ended the ancient world, and the question of what that something was has haunted scholars for as long as the ruins themselves have been known to exist. Tonight, we are going to trace that world from its height to its disappearance. We are going to walk through the palaces before they burned. We are going to understand the people who lived in them, who traded with each other across blue Mediterranean water, who wrote letters to each other on clay tablets that somehow survived while everything else turned to ash. We are going to examine every theory, every piece of evidence, every clay tablet and burned building and skeletal remain that historians and archaeologists have gathered in their long attempt to understand what happened. And we are going to sit with the mystery, because the honest answer is that we still do not know for certain. What we do know is that the world that existed before 1200 BC was astonishing in its complexity, its reach, and its beauty. And then it was gone. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Settle in. Let the weight of the day begin to loosen its grip. There is something quietly powerful about drifting towards sleep on the current of a story this old, this strange, this unresolved. The Bronze Age ended more than 3,000 years ago, and the people who lived through it left us enough clues to know that they did not see it coming. They were writing letters, managing harvests, worrying about grain prices and diplomatic marriages and the cost of tin, right up until the moment everything fell apart. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Before we can understand what ended the Bronze Age, we have to understand what the Bronze Age was, and to do that, we have to go back much further than the collapse itself. We have to go back to the beginning of it all, to the first moments when human beings looked at the raw material of the earth around them and began to imagine something new. The Bronze Age, in the Eastern Mediterranean, did not arrive suddenly. It grew, slowly and unevenly, out of the Copper Age that came before it, and before that, out of the Neolithic settlements that had been spreading across the region for thousands of years. But sometime around 3000 BC, something shifted. Someone, somewhere, possibly in the region we now call Anatolia, or possibly in Mesopotamia, or possibly in multiple places at roughly the same time, discovered that if you combined copper with tin, you got something neither metal alone could offer. You got bronze. Bronze was harder than copper. It held an edge longer. It could be worked into sharper tools, stronger weapons, more durable objects of every kind. And because it was better, it spread. The knowledge of how to make it, the demand for it, the trade networks required to supply the raw materials for it, all of this spread across the Eastern Mediterranean over the following centuries until bronze was not just a material, it was the foundation of civilization itself. This is worth pausing on because it helps explain how interconnected the late Bronze Age world truly was. Bronze required two ingredients: copper, which was relatively abundant in certain regions, particularly in Cyprus, whose very name in Latin, cuprum, gives us the modern word copper, and tin. Tin was the problem. Tin was rare. Tin deposits significant enough to mine existed only in a few places in the ancient world, places far removed from the centers of Bronze Age civilization. Tin came from Afghanistan. Tin came from Anatolia. Tin may have come from Cornwall in distant Britain, though the evidence for this trade route remains debated. The point is that tin had to travel vast distances to reach the smelters, who would combine it with copper to make bronze. And that travel required trade, and that trade required relationships. And those relationships required trust and communication and shared understanding between people who might live hundreds or thousands of miles apart. In other words, the simple fact that bronze required two ingredients from distant places built the late Bronze Age world into something that no previous human civilization had quite been. It built it into a network. By the time we reach the peak of this network, sometime around 1350 to 1200 BC, what existed in the Eastern Mediterranean was something that a modern person would recognize, at least in its basic shape. More than we might expect. There were great powers with spheres of influence and carefully negotiated relationships. There were smaller states navigating between those great powers, playing one off against another, seeking advantage and protection. There were merchant ships crossing the open sea, with holds full of raw materials and finished goods. There were letters being written by kings to other kings, addressed as brother, negotiating marriages and gifts and grievances. There were diplomats and translators and interpreters. There were grain surpluses being managed and redistributed through complex palace bureaucracies. There were craftsmen producing goods of extraordinary sophistication, things that have survived 3,000 years in the ground and still take the breath away when you see them in a museum case. The great powers of this world had names that some of us half remember from ancient history. Egypt, of course, which needs no introduction. At its height, under pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, Egypt was perhaps the single most powerful state in the ancient world. Its wealth, founded on the agricultural miracle of the Nile flood cycle, and its military power founded on chariots and archers, and the organizational genius of a state that had been managing large-scale human activity for more than 1,000 years before the Bronze Age collapse. But Egypt was not alone among the great powers. To the north and east, in the region we now call Turkey, the Hittites had built an empire that at its height rivaled Egypt in power and reach. The Hittites are fascinating to modern students of the ancient world, partly because they were so thoroughly forgotten. For centuries after the classical period, no one in Europe or the Middle East had any clear memory of who the Hittites had been. They appeared in the Bible, mentioned in passing, but their identity as the builders of a major empire was completely lost. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when archaeologists began excavating the Hittite capital of Hattusa in central Anatolia, that the world learned what had been sitting in the ground of modern Turkey, an entire imperial civilization, complete with law codes and diplomatic archives and military records, forgotten for more than 2,000 years. Alongside Egypt and the Hittites, there were other powers worth knowing. The Mycenaeans, whose culture dominated the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands in this period, are the people who would eventually, filtered through centuries of oral tradition and poetic transformation, become the Greeks of Homer's epics. The palaces they built at places like Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos were not the elegant columned structures we associate with classical Greece. They were massive, fortress-like buildings of enormous cut stone, equipped with elaborate systems of storage and record-keeping, evidence of centralized economies managing the production and distribution of textiles, oil, wine, grain, bronze, and human labor on a scale that seems almost surprising for the period. The Mycenaeans were seafarers and traders. They maintained connections with Egypt and with the Levantine coast and with Cyprus. They were present in the networks of the late Bronze Age world, not as peripheral actors, but as full participants. There was also Ugarit, a city-state on the coast of what is now Syria that deserves a kind of special status in any discussion of the late Bronze Age. Ugarit was not an empire. It was not a great power in the political sense, but it was a merchant city of extraordinary sophistication and reach, a place where the ships of half a dozen different cultures touched the shore, and where the goods of an entire interconnected world changed hands. Archaeologists excavating Ugarit in the 20th century found not just buildings and pottery, but archives of clay tablets written in multiple scripts and languages. Evidence of a city that was genuinely cosmopolitan in its connections. A place where Egyptian and Hittite and Mycenaean and Cypriot and Mesopotamian influences all mingled in the daily life of a single urban community. Ugarit, perhaps more than any other single site, lets us see what the late Bronze Age world actually felt like from the inside. And then there was the kingdom of Al-Ashir, which is almost certainly Cyprus, the great copper island sitting in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus was crucial to the Bronze Age economy in a way that is hard to overstate. The copper of Cyprus was the raw material that, combined with tin from distant sources, produced the bronze on which everything else depended. The kings of Al-Ashir corresponded regularly with the pharaohs of Egypt, negotiating the price of copper, complaining about pirates, requesting gifts of gold in return for their essential mineral exports. The letters they wrote to each other have survived. You can read them today, these 3,000-year-old messages about trade disputes and shipping costs, and feel the extraordinary ordinariness of them, the way they show you that the people of the Bronze Age were worried about the same basic things that people in positions of economic and political power have always worried about. This is the world we need to hold in our minds as we move forward. A world of interconnected great powers and smaller states, of merchant ships and palace bureaucracies, of clay tablet correspondence and carefully calibrated diplomatic marriages, of craftsmen producing objects of extraordinary skill, of trade routes stretching from Egypt to the Aegean, to Anatolia, to the Levant, to Mesopotamia and beyond. A world that had been building in complexity and reach for centuries, that seemed, to those living within it, like the natural and permanent order of things. And then, between roughly 1,200 and 1,150 BC, it ended. The first signs that something was wrong appear in the archaeological record and in the surviving texts sometime around 1,200 BC, though the exact timing varies by region and by site. What we see is not a single catastrophic event, but a gathering of pressures, a sense, reading the evidence, of a world beginning to strain at its edges before it finally breaks. Some of the earliest signs come from the texts themselves, from the clay tablets that the palace scribes of this period were still dutifully producing right up to the moment the palaces burned. At the Hittite capital of Hattusa, in the years just before the city was destroyed, the tablets record a mounting sense of crisis. There are letters requesting grain shipments with increasing urgency. There are references to internal political difficulties. There are hints of military threats on multiple frontiers simultaneously. At Ugarit, in what would prove to be the last years of that city's existence, the tablets tell a story of trade disruption and anxiety. There are references to ships that did not arrive when expected. There are letters warning of raiders. And then, famously, there is a letter that was found in the kiln where it was being baked. A letter that had been prepared for sending but never sent, because whatever happened at Ugarit happened before it could be dispatched. That letter warns, in terms that seem almost calm given what we know was coming, of enemy ships, of raids, of the inability to send assistance to an ally who was under attack. The imagery of that unsent letter is one of the most haunting in all of archaeology. A clay tablet, still in its kiln, still warm, never delivered, its message of warning and crisis preserved in the very moment of catastrophe that it was describing. Someone baked that tablet, and then the city burned, and the letter stayed in the ground for 3,000 years, waiting for the archaeologists who would eventually find it and read it and understand what it had been trying to say. What was it warning about? This is where the mystery deepens and branches, because the letter at Ugarit and the other evidence from this period points toward one of the most debated elements of the Bronze Age collapse. The tablets and inscriptions of the period refer repeatedly to a group of people called, in Egyptian texts, the Sea Peoples. These Sea Peoples appear in the historical record somewhat suddenly, sometime in the late 13th century BC, and they appear not as traders or diplomats, but as raiders, as destroyers, as a force moving through the eastern Mediterranean, leaving burned cities in their wake. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III who ruled in the early 12th century BC, left detailed inscriptions describing his battles against the Sea Peoples, including at the famous Medinet Habu temple, where carved reliefs show naval and land battles against these invaders. Ramesses claimed victory, and Egypt did survive the crisis that destroyed so many other states. But the nature and origin of the Sea Peoples remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient history. Who were the Sea Peoples? The honest answer is that we are still not entirely sure. The Egyptian inscriptions give them names, dividing them into groups: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Some of these names have been tentatively matched to peoples and places known from other sources. The Peliset are generally identified with the Philistines of the Bible, who settled in the Levant in the period following the collapse. The Denyen might be related to the Danaans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks, but these identifications are not certain, and more fundamentally, the question of where these people came from before they appear in the Egyptian records is genuinely unclear. One theory holds that the Sea Peoples were essentially refugees, people displaced from their homelands by whatever catastrophe was already beginning to unfold in the Aegean and Anatolia, driven by famine or military pressure or political collapse in their original territories, forced into movement, turning to raiding and migration as the only alternatives to starvation or subjugation. On this reading, the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but rather one of its symptoms, people set in motion by disasters that were already occurring elsewhere. Another theory emphasizes their role as active destroyers, a confederation of maritime raiders who descended on the coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean with calculated violence, targeting the wealth concentrated in those cities, burning what they could not carry away, and in the process, dismantling the trade networks and political structures that held the Bronze Age world together. The truth, as is so often the case in history, is probably somewhere between these positions and more complicated than either of them. The Sea Peoples were real, their raids were real, the destruction they caused was real, but they were operating in a world that was already under severe stress from multiple directions, and understanding the Bronze Age collapse requires understanding all of those stresses, not just the most dramatic and visible one. So, let us set the Sea Peoples aside for a moment and look at the other evidence. Let us think about climate. In recent decades, some of the most interesting new research into the Bronze Age collapse has focused not on armies or political conflicts, but on the physical environment. Paleoclimatologists, people who study the climate of the distant past, using techniques like the analysis of pollen trapped in ancient lake sediments, or the chemical signatures preserved in cave formations called speleothems, or the ring patterns of ancient trees, have been building an increasingly detailed picture of what the climate of the eastern Mediterranean was doing in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. And what that picture shows is striking. The evidence suggests that a prolonged drought, or more precisely, a series of droughts, struck the eastern Mediterranean in this period. The pollen records from lake sediments in Anatolia and the Levant show a significant decline in forest cover and agricultural pollen at exactly the time of the collapse, consistent with a severe reduction in rainfall. The isotope ratios preserved in cave formations in Greece and Turkey show a shift toward drier conditions. And perhaps most powerfully, a 2013 study published in the journal PLOS One analyzed pollen records from the Sea of Galilee in the modern-day region of Israel and found strong evidence for a major drought beginning around 1200 BC and lasting for roughly 3 centuries, exactly the period of the Bronze Age collapse and the subsequent Dark Ages. This matters enormously if you think about how the late Bronze Age economy actually worked. The palace economies of the Mycenaeans and the Hittites and the Ugaritic city-states were fundamentally agricultural. They depended on surplus grain production to feed their non-agricultural populations, their craftsmen and soldiers and administrators and palace scribes. They used grain surpluses as a form of currency and redistribution, managing the labor of their populations through the controlled allocation of food rations. The palace at Pylos in Greece, for example, whose Linear B tablets we can now read, was in its last years carefully managing hundreds of workers, tracking their rations, their assignments, their specializations, with the meticulous attention of a system that could not afford to waste anything. A system, in other words, that had very little margin for error. If you reduce the rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean by a significant amount for a significant period of time, you reduce the grain harvests. If you reduce the grain harvests, you reduce the surpluses that keep the palace economies functioning. If you reduce the surpluses, you reduce the ability of the palaces to maintain their craftsmen and administrators and soldiers. You reduce the goods available for trade. You reduce the income available to maintain the trade networks. You begin to pull on threads that hold the whole fabric together. And in a system this complex and this interconnected, pulling on one thread can eventually unravel things in ways that are hard to predict or contain. The climate evidence for drought is now considered by many scholars to be one of the strongest single explanations for the Bronze Age collapse, or at least one of its most important contributing factors. But it is also, almost certainly, not the whole story. Because droughts have struck the Mediterranean region many times in history, without producing collapses of this magnitude, something made the late Bronze Age world particularly vulnerable to the climate stress of around 1200 BC. An understanding that vulnerability requires us to think about the nature of the system itself. The late Bronze Age world was, in modern economic terms, highly globalized. It was deeply interconnected. It was dependent on long-distance trade for essential materials. And as modern economists and historians have pointed out in analyzing the collapse of the Bronze Age, these features, which are also the features that made the late Bronze Age so extraordinarily productive and sophisticated, are also the features that made it fragile. A world that depends on tin from Afghanistan, reaching smelters in Anatolia, where it is combined with copper from Cyprus, where the resulting bronze is then shipped to Greece to equip soldiers who protect grain stores, that feed palace workers, who produce textiles that are shipped to Egypt in exchange for gold that goes back to Cyprus to pay for more. Copper is a world in which a disruption at any single point can cascade through the entire system. Complexity theorists who have studied the Bronze Age collapse use a term for this kind of vulnerability. They call it the brittleness of complex systems. The idea is that as a system grows more complex, it becomes more productive and more capable, but it also accumulates more points of potential failure and more pathways through which a local failure can propagate into a systemic one. The late Bronze Age world was, in this sense, a system that had grown so elaborate and so interconnected that it had become brittle. It could sustain small disruptions. It had survived famines and droughts before, and military conflicts, and internal political crises. But what it faced around 1200 BC was not a single disruption. It was a convergence of multiple disruptions at the same time, in multiple places, in a system that could not absorb them all simultaneously. This convergence theory, sometimes called the systems collapse model, is currently one of the most widely accepted frameworks among scholars for understanding what happened. On this view, the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by any single factor. It was caused by the simultaneous interaction of multiple factors, each of which might have been manageable in isolation, but which together exceeded the capacity of the system to adapt and recover. Those factors included climate change and drought. They included the raids and migrations of the sea peoples, who were themselves probably set in motion partly by climate-related food shortages in their own regions. They included internal political instability in several of the major powers, particularly the Hittite Empire, which in its final decades was torn by succession crises and rebellions. They included disruptions to the trade networks that supplied the tin and copper needed to maintain bronze production. They included the possibility of earthquakes, which archaeological evidence suggests struck several major sites in this period. They included disease, though the evidence for this is less direct. And they included, perhaps most importantly, the dynamics of the interconnected system itself, the way that trouble in one place could quickly become trouble everywhere. Let us spend some time now in the places themselves, the actual cities and palaces of the late Bronze Age, because to understand what was lost, we need to understand what existed. And what existed was extraordinary. Start with Hattusa, the Hittite capital. Hattusa was situated on a high plateau in central Anatolia, in a landscape of bare rock and scrub that today looks as empty and remote as the surface of another world. The Hittites chose this site for its defensibility, and they built on it with an energy and ambition that is still visible in the ruins. The city at its height covered an area of nearly 2 square kilometers and was surrounded by massive stone walls studded with towers, walls of such impressive construction that they have survived, in places, to the present day. Within those walls were temples, dozens of them, because the Hittites were a people of extraordinary religious complexity who worshipped what their own texts called the 1,000 gods of Hatti, a pantheon assembled from the religious traditions of all the peoples the Hittite Empire had absorbed. There were palaces, administrative buildings, granaries, workshops. There were residential quarters for the population of a functioning capital city, and there were the archives. The archives at Hattusa are perhaps the greatest single treasure that survived the destruction of the city. The Hittites used a script called cuneiform, borrowed originally from the Mesopotamian tradition, and they wrote on clay tablets that, like all clay tablets, were accidentally preserved when the city burned. The archive contains approximately 30,000 tablet fragments, covering an enormous range of subjects. There are royal annals recording the military campaigns of Hittite kings. There are law codes. There are religious rituals. There are diplomatic correspondence, most famously including the world's oldest surviving peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, agreed between Ramesses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Hattusili III, after a famous battle in 1274 BC. Reading this treaty today, with its careful formulas of mutual recognition and its promises of extradition and alliance and mutual defense, is to encounter Bronze Age geopolitics with a directness that is genuinely startling. These were sophisticated states with sophisticated understandings of international relations, negotiating in a framework of law and diplomacy that would not seem entirely out of place in the modern world. And then, sometime around 1180 BC, Hattusa burned. The archives survived because the fire baked the clay tablets that contained them, but the city itself was destroyed, and it was never rebuilt. The people of the Hittite Empire did not simply disappear, they dispersed. They survived as individuals and families and communities, but the imperial state they had built was gone. The capital was gone, the administrative system was gone, the writing tradition was gone. Hatti, as a political and cultural entity, ceased to exist. Move now to the Mycenaean world of Greece and the Aegean. The palace at Pylos, in the southwestern Peloponnese, sometimes called the Palace of Nestor, after the legendary king who appears in Homer's Iliad as the wise old counselor of the Greek forces at Troy, was in its final years one of the most sophisticated administrative centers in the Aegean world. The tablets found in its archive are written in Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaeans to record the Greek language in an adapted form of an earlier Cretan writing system. The Linear B tablets were deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, an English architect working partly as an amateur linguist in one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the 20th century. When Ventris and his collaborators finally cracked the code, they were able to read documents that had been sealed in the ground for more than 3,000 years. And what those documents revealed was a complex, highly organized palace economy managing resources, labor, and production across a wide territory. The last tablets from Pylos, those written in what was apparently the final period before the palace's destruction, are particularly interesting because some scholars believe they show signs of emergency. There are tablets that seem to record the rapid mobilization of rowers to man ships, perhaps in response to a naval threat. There are references to watchers posted on the coast, lookouts scanning the sea. There are records of bronze being collected from temples and sanctuaries, presumably to be melted down and recast into weapons, a desperate measure suggesting that the regular supply chains for metal had broken down. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, whether or not these final tablets really do capture the last frantic preparations of a palace administration facing imminent destruction, the result is the same. The palace burned, and it was never rebuilt. The Linear B writing system disappeared. The The level of administrative and economic organization that the tablets reflect vanished from the Greek world for centuries. What followed in Greece after the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces is what archaeologists call the Greek Dark Ages, and the word dark is well chosen. The population of Greece fell dramatically. Archaeological surveys suggest a reduction of perhaps 50 to 75% in the number of inhabited sites compared to the Mycenaean peak. The surviving communities were smaller, simpler, and more isolated. Long-distance trade essentially ceased. The production of elaborate goods fell off dramatically, and the writing system, Linear B, disappeared so completely that when Greeks began writing again centuries later, they used an entirely different script, the alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, with no apparent memory of the earlier tradition. 3 or 4 centuries of Greek history left almost no written record because there was no writing to make a record in. This is one of the most remarkable things about the Bronze Age collapse. It did not just destroy cities and kill people. It destroyed literacy in some of the regions it struck. It destroyed the transmission of knowledge across generations that writing makes possible. And in doing so, it created genuine breaks in the historical record, gaps that we are still working to fill with archaeological evidence, gaps that help explain why, for so long, the Bronze Age itself was largely unknown to the classical world that came after it. The Greeks of the 5th century BC, the Greeks of Herodotus and Thucydides and Sophocles, did not know they had predecessors in the Mycenaean palaces. They thought their world was relatively new. They had myths, filtered through centuries of oral tradition, that preserved dim memories of an earlier heroic age, the age of Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon. But they had no written records, no history, no clear understanding of what those heroic figures actually represented. Now let us turn to Ugarit more carefully, because Ugarit is in some ways the most intimate window we have into the world that ended. Ugarit sat at the northern end of what is now the Syrian coast, on a tell, an artificial mound created over millennia by the accumulation of human occupation overlooking the Mediterranean. It was a port city of significant prosperity, its wealth built on commerce. Ships from Egypt and Cyprus and the Aegean and the Levantine coast all called at Ugarit's harbour. The city's merchant community spoke and wrote multiple languages. The palace maintained archives in Egyptian hieroglyphics and in Babylonian cuneiform and in a local alphabetic script that was one of the earliest alphabets ever developed, a script that played an important role in the eventual development of the alphabets we use today. The tablets from Ugarit cover an enormous range of human activity. There are mythological texts, including versions of stories about the god Baal, that are clearly related to traditions that would eventually find their way into the Hebrew Bible. There are legal documents, property records, contracts, court decisions. There are administrative records of palace business, lists of craftsmen and their rations, records of tribute received from subject communities. There are diplomatic letters exchanged with the Hittite king, with the pharaoh of Egypt, with the rulers of neighboring states. And then there are the final letters, the ones from the last years of Ugarit's existence, the ones that tell the story of a city in gathering crisis. Some of these final letters are genuinely moving to read, even across the distance of 3,000 years. There is a letter from the king of Alashia, which is Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit. It is a warning. It tells the king of Ugarit that enemy ships have been seen, that the enemy is conducting raids on the coast, that the situation is serious. It urges him to take precautions. There is a letter from the king of Ugarit to the Hittite king, telling him that the city is under attack, that there are ships offshore, that the city's own army has been sent to Hittite territory, leaving Ugarit without defenders. He is asking for help. There is the letter found in the kiln, the one that never made it out of the city, a desperate message that captures in its clay the moment of catastrophe itself. What happened to Ugarit? The city was burned. The archaeological evidence makes this clear. There are signs of violent destruction across the site, and then it was abandoned. It was never rebuilt. Unlike some of the cities that were destroyed in this period, and then eventually reoccupied, Ugarit simply ended. The mound of its ruins sat empty, slowly losing its shape to wind and rain and the encroachment of vegetation for 3,000 years, until the French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer began excavating it in 1929 and began to discover what was buried there. The The story of Ugarit's rediscovery is itself a remarkable one. It began in 1928, when a Syrian farmer ploughing his field near the coastal town of Latakia accidentally broke through into the ceiling of an ancient tomb. The discovery attracted the attention of French archaeological authorities, who sent Schaefer to investigate. What Schaefer found when he began excavating the nearby mound was one of the most significant archaeological sites of the 20th century, a complete Bronze Age city preserved under more than 3,000 years of earth. Its buildings, its archives, its artifacts of daily and ceremonial life, all waiting to be understood. The excavations at Ugarit have continued, with various interruptions, ever since, and they have produced a picture of Bronze Age urban life of extraordinary detail and intimacy. We know what the houses looked like. We know what kinds of goods the merchants traded. We know the names of individuals who lived and worked in the city. We know something of their religious life, their mythology, their legal customs. We know, from the administrative tablets, how the palace managed its resources and its workforce. And we know, from those final desperate letters, something of how it felt to be there at the end, watching the ships approach and the help not come. There is another thread in the story of the Bronze Age collapse that we have not yet pulled on, and it is one that leads in a direction that might seem surprising. It leads inward. It leads not to external threats or climate shifts, but to the possibility that the Bronze Age civilizations were, in some sense, destroying themselves from within. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were, by modern standards, enormously extractive and hierarchical systems. The palaces sat at the top of a rigid social pyramid, controlling the production and distribution of essential goods, managing the labor of a large servile or semi-servile population, and concentrating wealth in the hands of a small elite. The people at the bottom of this system, the agricultural workers, the craftsmen who worked for palace rations, the sailors who crewed the merchant ships, the soldiers who fought the palace's wars, had relatively little of the surplus wealth that their labor helped create. They had enough to survive, or close to it, but they did not have much margin. And when times got hard, when the harvests failed, or the trade networks broke down, or the raids began, they were the first to suffer. There are hints in the archaeological and textual record of internal social stress in the decades before the collapse. There are references in the Ugarit tablets to villages that have been abandoned, to people who have fled. There are signs of reduced population in some areas before the final destruction of the palace centers. There are hints, tantalizing and indirect, of something like popular unrest. The palace systems may have been losing their grip on the populations they depended on even before the external pressures of the sea peoples and the climate crisis began to bite. Some scholars have gone further, arguing that the collapse of the Bronze Age palace economies was in part a class revolution, a breakdown of the coercive system that bound agricultural workers and craftsmen to palace authority, made possible by the disruption of the external crises. On this reading, the fires that ended cities like Ugarit and Pylos were not only lit by raiders from outside, but also by people from within or nearby, people who saw in the moment of external crisis an opportunity to break the chains of a system that had extracted their labor for generations. The evidence for this interpretation is indirect and debated, and most scholars are cautious about embracing it too enthusiastically. But it is a reminder that the Bronze Age was not a paradise destroyed from outside. It was a complex and stratified society with its own internal tensions and contradictions. Let us turn now to Egypt, because Egypt is the great exception to the story of the Bronze Age collapse, the civilization that survived when almost everything around it was destroyed. Understanding how Egypt survived, and what it cost to do so, tells us something important about the nature of the collapse itself. Egypt, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, was ruled by Ramesses II, and then, after his death in 1213 BC, following a reign of 67 years, by a succession of shorter-lived pharaohs before Ramesses III took the throne around 1186 BC. Ramesses II is the pharaoh you probably know best, the great self-promoter, the builder of Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, the pharaoh whose body now rests in the Cairo Museum, and who some traditions identify with the unnamed pharaoh of the Exodus story. His reign was in many ways the high water mark of Egyptian imperial power. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh, agreed to that World Historical Peace Treaty, and presided over a period of prosperity and construction that left monuments across Egypt and Nubia and the Levant. But the Egypt that Ramesses III inherited was not the Egypt of Ramesses II. The pharaohs between them had been shorter-lived and less successful. The empire in the Levant was fraying. The populations on the borders were becoming increasingly restive. And then the Sea Peoples came. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III near Luxor, describe in detail the encounters between Egypt and the Sea Peoples, and they are worth pausing on. The inscriptions describe a movement of peoples that is explicitly described as a mass migration, not just a military raid, but an entire population on the move, with families and household goods and animals moving overland and by sea simultaneously. The inscriptions claim, in the grandiloquent style of Egyptian royal texts that we have to read with appropriate skepticism, that these peoples destroyed everything in their path, that no land could stand before them, that they came from the sea and from the land at once, that their advance was unstoppable, except, apparently, by Ramesses III. The Egyptian inscriptions describe two major battles against the Sea Peoples, one on land, one at sea, both of which Egypt claims to have won decisively. The relief carvings at Medinet Habu show these battles in extraordinary detail, particularly the naval battle, which is depicted with a dynamism and specificity that suggests the artist either witnessed the battle or received detailed descriptions of it. Egyptian ships with grappling hooks and archers are shown engaging with enemy vessels in a confined waterway, probably one of the river mouths of the Nile Delta, capturing enemy ships and killing their crews. Egypt survived, but it survived in a diminished form. The empire in the Levant was effectively over. Egyptian presence in Canaan faded rapidly after Ramesses III. The long-distance trade networks that had connected Egypt to the Mycenaean world and to Ugarit and to the Hittites were disrupted because most of the other participants in those networks no longer existed as organized states. The population of Egypt itself contracted in the following decades and centuries. The wealth that had funded the monument-building program of the great pharaohs dwindled. The political stability that had characterized the great dynasties began to break down. Egypt entered its own long twilight, less dramatic than the collapses elsewhere, but real nonetheless. There is something telling in the contrast between the Egyptian accounts of the Sea Peoples and the accounts from the northern cities. Egypt describes what it faced and claims victory. The northern cities simply stopped producing records. The contrast is partly a function of Egypt's survival and the destruction of the others, but it is also a function of Egypt's particular durability as an institution. Egypt had been a functioning state for more than 2,000 years by the time of the Bronze Age collapse. It had survived droughts and internal conflicts and foreign invasions before. Its administrative and cultural institutions had deep roots. Its ideology of divine kingship provided a kind of social glue that helped hold the population together even in difficult times. And the Nile itself, unlike the rain-dependent agricultural systems of Anatolia and Greece, provided a relatively reliable source of water even during periods of reduced rainfall, because the Nile's annual flood depended not on local rainfall, but on rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands, thousands of miles away. None of this made Egypt immune to the pressures of the collapse, but it made Egypt more resilient than its contemporaries, and that resilience was the difference between survival and extinction as a political entity. Now let us think about the archaeological signature of the collapse more carefully, because the physical evidence in the ground tells a story that is in some ways even more powerful than the textual evidence. At site after site across the eastern Mediterranean, the same pattern appears in the archaeological layers. There is a layer of prosperous late Bronze Age occupation, full of elaborate pottery and bronze objects and evidence of complex economic activity. Then there is a layer of burning, sometimes very thick, indicating fires that raged long enough and hot enough to leave deep deposits of ash and charred material. And then, above the burning, either nothing emptiness, abandonment, the site left empty for generations, or a dramatically simplified occupation, cruder pottery, less bronze, smaller and less permanent structures, a population living at a fraction of the complexity and density of what came before. This pattern appears at Mycenae, at Tiryns, at Pylos, at Hattusa, at Ugarit, at multiple sites across Cyprus, at dozens of smaller sites across the broader region. The uniformity of the pattern across such a wide area is part of what makes the Bronze Age collapse so striking to archaeologists. This was not just one city having a bad century. This was an entire civilization having a catastrophic generation. Some sites show signs of violent destruction, evidence of burning that was caused by human action rather than accident. Arrowheads and weapons in the ruins, bodies that were not given proper burial, signs of hasty departure or violent death. Other sites show abandonment without obvious violence, populations that left before the fire came, or that simply stopped maintaining their settlements as the economic and political systems that had sustained them ceased to function. The variation between sites suggests that the collapse unfolded differently in different places, with different immediate causes, while the overall pattern across the region tells us that something systemic was occurring. The pottery evidence is particularly informative. Pottery is almost indestructible, and the style of pottery or culture produces changes in recognizable ways over time, so archaeologists can use pottery sequences to date occupation levels with considerable precision. In the layers just before the collapse, the pottery of the late Bronze Age world shows the evidence of the interconnected trade network that sustained it. The same pottery styles appear across multiple regions, showing that craftsmen were influenced by styles from distant places, that goods were moving across the Mediterranean. After the collapse, the pottery becomes local, regional, simpler. The connections that had allowed styles to spread across great distances are gone. There is one more thread to pull on before we move to the question of what came after the collapse, and it is a thread that leads into what might seem like surprising territory. It leads to the question of earthquakes. The earthquake theory for the Bronze Age collapse has a history that stretches back several decades, associated particularly with the archaeologist Amos Nur, who spent much of his career studying the geological record of the Eastern Mediterranean, and arguing that a prolonged sequence of major earthquakes played a significant role in the destruction of the late Bronze Age cities. The Eastern Mediterranean is, in geological terms, one of the most seismically active regions in the world. The African plate is pushing northward against the Eurasian plate, and the resulting tectonic stress is released in earthquakes that have been occurring throughout human history and before. Nur and his colleagues argued that the evidence at multiple Bronze Age sites shows signs of earthquake damage before or alongside the evidence of fire, suggesting that earthquakes may have triggered or contributed to the destruction. The collapsed walls at some sites are consistent with seismic damage. The distribution of destruction across multiple sites that are geographically dispersed but share the same seismic zone is consistent with a series of major earthquakes. Not all scholars have been convinced by the earthquake hypothesis, and the debate about its relative importance continues. The difficulty is that distinguishing earthquake damage from fire damage and from the damage caused by human violence is not always straightforward in the archaeological record, and proving that the earthquakes preceded rather than followed the human-caused destruction is methodologically challenging. But the theory has not been abandoned, and the most sophisticated current thinking about the collapse tends to include seismic activity as one element in the convergence of causes, even if it is not given the prominence that Nur gave it. What we are left with, as we try to understand the Bronze Age collapse, is a picture of extraordinary complexity, a world under simultaneous stress from multiple directions, a climate becoming drier and more hostile to the rain-dependent agriculture that sustained the palace economies, raids and migrations of people set in motion by the very disruptions that were occurring elsewhere, people who themselves were fleeing disaster and in their movement causing new disasters, internal political instability in several of the great powers, particularly the Hittite Empire, possible seismic disruption, internal social tensions that may have made some populations less inclined to defend the palace systems that had extracted their labor. And over everything, the fragility of a highly complex, highly interconnected system that had grown too dependent on the smooth functioning of all its parts to survive their simultaneous failure. The historian Eric Klein, whose 2014 book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, brought the Bronze Age collapse to a wide popular audience, uses the phrase perfect storm to describe this convergence of causes. It is a useful phrase, not because it perfectly captures the dynamics of what happened, but because it conveys the essential point. No single cause was sufficient on its own. The Bronze Age world had survived individual crises before. What it could not survive was the simultaneous occurrence of multiple crises that interacted with and amplified each other. The climate dried. The harvests fell short. The palace economies began to strain under reduced surpluses. Trade networks became unreliable as the political instability of neighboring states disrupted shipping and overland routes. People in marginal areas began to move, driven by hunger and the failure of the systems that had sustained them. Some of those moving people became raiders, targeting the wealthy coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean. The raids further disrupted trade and produced more refugees. Earthquakes may have added to the physical destruction of some cities. Internal tensions that had been suppressed by the coercive power of the palace economies found outlets in the general disorder, and the system, too complex and too interconnected and too inflexible to adapt quickly enough, came apart. In the places where it came apart most completely, the result was not just political change, but civilizational regression. The technology of writing disappeared from Greece. The long-distance trade in copper and tin that had made bronze possible collapsed, and with it the production of bronze itself declined. Population fell as people died in the initial violence, or fled, or starved in the years of agricultural failure, or failed to have children in the uncertainty that followed. The elaborate, specialized division of labor that had sustained palace craftsmen and scribes and administrators could no longer be supported when the surpluses were gone and the trade networks were broken. People fell back on simpler, more local, more self-sufficient ways of living. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, perhaps, because it is the part that most directly confronts us with the possibility of loss. Not just the loss of cities and palaces and armies, not just the loss of political structures and diplomatic treaties, but the loss of knowledge, the loss of skill, the loss of the accumulated learning of centuries. When the palace scribes stopped writing, they took with them not just the records they were keeping, but the tradition of literacy itself, at least in the regions where that literacy did not survive. When the craftsmen who knew how to produce certain kinds of elaborate goods dispersed or died, the techniques they knew went with them. When the trade networks that connected copper from Cyprus to tin from Afghanistan ceased to function, the ability to produce bronze at scale disappeared, and communities that had been relying on bronze tools for generations had to find other ways to meet their material needs. The transition to iron that characterizes the early Iron Age, the period that follows the Bronze Age collapse across much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, was, in some respects, a response to this loss. Iron was widely available in a way that the combination of copper and tin was not. A community that could no longer access the trade networks needed to supply bronze could still, if it had access to iron ore and the knowledge of how to work it, produce functional metal tools and weapons. The spread of ironworking technology in the centuries after the collapse was in part an adaptation to the new world the collapse had created, a world in which the long-distance trade networks of the late Bronze Age no longer existed to supply the ingredients for bronze. But the transition to iron was not immediate, and it was not smooth. The centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, in Greece and in Anatolia and in the Levant, show the archaeological signature of a world that has lost more than it has yet replaced. Smaller settlements, simpler goods, less specialization of labor, less evidence of organized trade, less evidence of organized anything really. The palace economies were gone, and nothing had yet emerged to replace them at a comparable level of complexity and scale. And yet the darkness was not total, and it was not permanent. People survived. Communities maintained themselves. Knowledge was preserved, though often in reduced and fragmented form. The Phoenicians, the maritime people of the Levantine coast, who had been part of the Bronze Age network as the inhabitants of cities like Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, survived the collapse with their seafaring traditions intact, and in the subsequent centuries built a new trading network that in some respects picked up where the Bronze Age network had left off. The Assyrians, whose empire had roots in the Bronze Age, but whose greatest power came later, expanded aggressively in the Iron Age, and eventually built one of the most formidable military states the ancient world had ever seen. The Greeks, after their centuries of darkness, emerged with a new cultural and political vitality that would eventually produce the classical civilization we know from history books and museum galleries. And in the silence and simplicity of the Dark Ages, something was also being transformed. The Bronze Age palace economies had been rigidly hierarchical, extractive, dependent on the centralized control of surplus agricultural production. The cultures that emerged in the Iron Age, at least in some regions, showed a different kind of social organization, more dispersed, more local, less dependent on the central accumulation and redistribution of wealth by palace elites. In Greece, the city-state, the polis, would eventually develop as a political form that was in many respects the opposite of the Mycenaean palace, a community of citizens rather than a palace of managed laborers, though this transformation took centuries and passed through many intermediate stages. There is a historian named Joseph Tainter who wrote a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies, published in 1988, which is still one of the most thought-provoking frameworks for understanding what happened in the Bronze Age. Tainter's central argument is that complex societies invest increasing resources in maintaining their complexity, and that there comes a point at which the returns on that investment begin to diminish. The administrative overhead of running a complex palace economy eventually exceeds the productivity gains that the complexity makes possible. When that point is reached, collapse becomes not just possible but, paradoxically, in some sense rational, a release of the burden of complexity that the system can no longer sustain. On Tainter's reading, the Bronze Age collapse was not purely a disaster. It was also, in a deep structural sense, an adaptation, a brutal and costly reset that allowed the surviving populations to rebuild on a simpler, more sustainable basis. This is a framework that has generated considerable debate among historians and archaeologists, and it should be treated with caution, because there is a real risk of imposing a teleological tidiness on what was, for the people who lived through it, a catastrophe of the most immediate and personal kind. The scribes at Pylos who were frantically collecting bronze from the temples in their last months, the merchants at Ugarit watching the ships approach on a morning that would prove to be their last, the families fleeing through the smoke of burning cities. These people were not experiencing an adaptive reset. They were experiencing the end of everything they had known. But Tainter's framework does help us think about why the world that eventually emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was different in character from the world that preceded it, and perhaps, in some respects, more resilient. The Iron Age civilizations that developed in the centuries after the collapse in Greece and in the Levant and in Anatolia and elsewhere were generally not organized around the kind of highly centralized palace economy that characterized the late Bronze Age. They developed more diversified, more locally grounded social and economic structures. The city-states of Greece, the tribal confederacies of the early Iron Age, Near East, even the Phoenician trading cities, all represented a kind of decentralization compared to the palatial world of the late Bronze Age. This decentralization made them, in some respects, less vulnerable to the kind of systemic cascade failure that had destroyed their predecessors. But we should not romanticize the Bronze Age collapse or its aftermath. The centuries of the Dark Ages were, by any reasonable measure, a period of genuine human suffering and loss. Population declined. Material living standards fell for most people. The elaborate cultural achievements of the late Bronze Age, the palace frescoes and the Linear B archives and the sophisticated gold and ivory and faience craftwork were lost. The oral traditions that preserved memories of the Bronze Age world became, over the generations, increasingly mythologized and distorted. until the Mycenaean palaces became the legendary halls of Homeric heroes, and the real history of the period was buried not just in the earth, but in the transforming amber of myth. Homer is, in this context, one of the most extraordinary figures in all of ancient literature, precisely because of what his poems preserve and what they transform. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed in something like their current form in the 8th century BC, are set in a world that is recognizably, if distantly, related to the Mycenaean Bronze Age. The heroes fight with bronze weapons. They are organized in a social structure that has recognizable echoes of the Mycenaean warrior aristocracy. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad lists Greek cities and regions whose geographic relationship to each other corresponds in many respects to the Mycenaean settlement pattern revealed by archaeology. The gifts of gold and bronze that flow between kings and heroes in Homer have recognizable parallels in the gift exchange between Bronze Age rulers documented in the Amarna letters and the Ugarit archives. But Homer's world is also, in crucial respects, not the Mycenaean world. The palace bureaucracies that are so central to the Linear B tablets are invisible in Homer. The palace scribes who managed grain rations and textile production and bronze stockpiles are absent. The elaborate administrative apparatus of the Mycenaean state has no reflection in the Homeric poems. What Homer has instead is a heroic society that resembles, in its social structure, the chieftain-based warrior culture of the Greek Dark Ages, more than it resembles the palace world of the Bronze Age. The traditions that Homer inherited and transformed had been filtered through 4 or 5 centuries of oral transmission by people who no longer had any direct memory of, or access to, the literate palace culture of Mycenae. This is both a loss and a creation. It is a loss because the real history of the Bronze Age world was buried in the transformation. It is a creation because what emerged from that transformation was one of the greatest works of literature in the human record, a pair of poems that have shaped Western culture for nearly 3,000 years, and that continue to be read and studied and adapted and argued over in the 21st century. The collapse of the Bronze Age, in the Aegean at least, was the precondition for Homer. The catastrophe that ended one world was the silence in which the seeds of another were planted. Let us come back now to the question we began with. What really ended the ancient world? What really caused the Bronze Age collapse? The honest answer, the answer that emerges from the evidence and from the scholarship, is that we cannot point to a single cause. The Bronze Age collapse was the product of a convergence, a perfect storm of interacting factors that individually would have been manageable and that collectively exceeded the capacity of a highly complex but brittle system to survive. The climate changed and the harvests failed. The sea peoples moved across the eastern Mediterranean in raids and migrations that destroyed cities and disrupted trade. The Hittite Empire, already weakened by internal succession crises, could not withstand the combined pressure. The Mycenaean palaces, sitting at the edge of a disrupted trade network, without the bronze and the grain that their administrative systems had managed, collapsed. Ugarit burned. Cyprus was raided. City after city in the Levant was destroyed or abandoned. But if we had to identify the single most important structural factor, the one without which the others might not have been sufficient, it would probably be the interconnected complexity of the late Bronze Age world itself. The same network that made the Bronze Age so productive, that allowed the pharaohs of Egypt to build pyramids and the Hittite kings to negotiate world historical peace treaties, and the merchants of Ugarit to move goods across half the known world, was also the network that made the Bronze Age so fragile. In a world so interconnected, the failure of one node propagated to others. The disruption of one trade route affected all the others. The collapse of one palace economy reduced the market for goods from all the others. The fall of the Hittite Empire removed a stabilizing force that had helped manage conflicts across a vast region, and the instability that followed spread in waves across the interconnected world. The Bronze Age world was, in modern terminology, too big to fail, and therefore it failed completely. There is something in this that speaks to us across 3,000 years, though we should be careful about drawing too direct a line from the Bronze Age to our own moment. The Late Bronze Age was not the modern world, and the differences between them are at least as important as the similarities. But the basic insight that complex, highly interconnected systems are vulnerable to cascade failures in ways that simpler systems are not, that the very features that make a system productive can also make it fragile, that there may come a point at which the complexity of a system exceeds its capacity to manage the problems that complexity creates. All of this resonates in a world of global supply chains and interconnected financial systems and climate change and the other stresses of our own historical moment. The scholars who study the Bronze Age collapse do not draw these parallels to frighten us. They draw them, when they draw them at all, as a way of illuminating the dynamics of complex systems in general, of which the Late Bronze Age and our own civilization are both examples. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that civilizational complexity is not permanent, that the elaborate systems human beings build to manage their collective lives are always contingent, always dependent on the continuation of the conditions that made them possible, always more fragile than they appear from the inside. But it is also a reminder that human beings survive. Not all of them, not in every place, not without terrible cost, but they survive. The Dark Ages, after the Bronze Age collapse, were not the end of humanity or even the end of civilization. They were a period of regrouping, of rebuilding at a smaller and simpler scale, of the slow recovery that eventually produced the Iron Age cultures of Greece and the Levant and Anatolia, which in turn produced the classical civilizations that we in the Western tradition tend to think of as the foundation of our world. The people of Ugarit, or most of them, survived the burning of their city. They scattered to other places, carried what knowledge and skill they could, and built new lives. The scribes of Pylos, who fled or died in the destruction of their palace, had children and grandchildren who continued to live in Greece through the Dark Ages, maintaining community, maintaining something of the cultural tradition, even without the writing that had made the palace culture possible. The farmers of Anatolia, who no longer served Hittite kings, found other ways to organize their lives, other sources of authority and meaning and community. The thread of human continuity, frayed and damaged and reduced, was never entirely broken. And 3,000 years later, we are here, sitting with the mystery of what ended the ancient world, still finding it remarkable, still finding it resonant, still finding it worth understanding. The scribes who wrote those last desperate letters at Ugarit could not have imagined us. They could not have imagined that their words, baked by accident into the clay of a catastrophe, would be read by people 3 millennia in their future. But they wrote anyway, as people always write, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to communicate across the distance between one mind and another. There is one more thing worth saying, before we let the story of the Bronze Age collapse settle into the quiet that follows the end of things. It is about what we do not know, and about why that matters. For all the scholarship and archaeology and paleoclimatology and clay tablet translation that has gone into understanding the Bronze Age collapse, there is still much that we do not know. We do not know exactly who the Sea Peoples were or where they came from. We do not know the precise sequence of events at any single site. We do not know how much of the destruction was caused by external raiders, how much by internal revolt, how much by the chain reactions of a collapsing, interconnected system. We do not know whether the drought came before the raids or the raids before the drought, or how these factors interacted in the consciousness of the people who experienced them. We do not know the names of most of the people who lived through this period, or what they felt, or what they understood about what was happening to them. This uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is an honest reflection of the limits of the evidence. The Bronze Age collapse happened more than 3,000 years ago, in a period from which our documentary evidence is fragmentary, and our archaeological evidence, for all its richness, can only tell us so much. The human experience of the collapse, the fear and the grief and the confusion and the desperate adaptation, lives now only in the interpretations we make of broken pottery and burned tablets and the distribution of settlement sites across a landscape. But the uncertainty itself has a kind of value. It keeps the question open. It keeps us curious. It reminds us that the past is not a closed book but a living mystery, one that yields new answers as new techniques are developed and new evidence is found. but one that also always retains its secrets. The Bronze Age collapse will not be fully explained in our lifetime. New paleoclimatic data will continue to refine our understanding of the drought. New excavations will continue to produce new tablets and new architectural sequences. New analytical techniques will continue to extract new information from existing finds. And the scholars who work on this period will continue to argue, as scholars always argue, about the relative importance of the different factors, about the sequence of events, about the meaning of the evidence. That argument, that ongoing scholarly conversation about what happened and why, is itself a kind of monument to the world that was lost. The people of the late Bronze Age, the scribes and merchants and palace administrators and sea captains and farmers and craftsmen of Ugarit and Pylos and Hattusa and Mycenae and all the other cities and towns and villages of the late Bronze Age world did not survive to tell their own story. The story was buried with them, in the clay and ash of the cities they built and lost. But we are still trying to hear it. We are still digging in the ground and translating the tablets and studying the pollen in the lake sediments and arguing about the evidence. We have not forgotten them, even though they have been gone for 3,000 years. There is something about the Bronze Age collapse that gets under the skin, and it is something that is hard to articulate precisely, but that has to do with scale. With the scale of what was built, and with the scale of what was lost, the late Bronze Age world was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable achievement of human civilization. It had taken millennia to build, from the first Neolithic villages, to the Copper Age, to the Bronze Age, to the sophisticated, interconnected, literate world of the late Bronze Age. And it ended, not gradually, not over comfortable centuries, but within a human lifetime, within the time from a child's birth to an old person's death. The world that had existed changed beyond recognition. That kind of rupture, that kind of loss of the familiar, is something that resonates at a deep human level. We are, as a species, deeply attached to the continuity of the world we know. The people of Ugarit, in those final years, watching their trade partners fail and their allies stop responding to their letters and their food supplies dwindle and the enemy ships appear on the horizon, must have experienced a particular kind of disorientation, the disorientation of seeing the world you understood, the world you had navigated successfully your whole life, becoming incomprehensible. The Bronze Age was ending, but they did not have that phrase. They did not have the framework to understand what was happening to them in those terms. They had only the immediate experience of things going wrong, in ways that the tools and knowledge and relationships that had served them so well were no longer sufficient to address. In their clay tablets, even in the most bureaucratic and routine of them, there is the faint trace of lives being lived in a world that, for all its differences from our own, was recognizably a world of human beings managing the ordinary challenges of existence. People worrying about grain prices and trade delays and diplomatic slights and the cost of bronze. People writing to their mothers and their kings. People recording the distribution of rations to workers and the receipt of tribute from subject towns. People doing the daily work of keeping a complex society functioning. And then, suddenly, silence. The silence of the Bronze Age collapse is one of history's most profound pauses. A world that had been producing tablets and letters and palace records and diplomatic correspondence for centuries simply stopped. The scribes stopped writing. The palaces stopped functioning. The ships stopped sailing. The merchants stopped trading. And in that silence, something new, smaller and simpler, and less connected and less sophisticated, began the long, slow work of becoming the next world. We are here, 3,000 years later, because those smaller and simpler communities survived and grew and rebuilt. We carry within our cultural traditions, often without knowing it, elements that trace back through the centuries to the world that emerged from the Dark Ages after the Bronze Age collapse. The alphabet you are using to read this traces a genealogy that leads back through the Phoenicians to the scribal traditions of the Bronze Age Levant. The political concepts of citizenship and the city-state that run through the Western tradition trace a lineage that leads back to the Greek recovery from the Dark Ages. The religious traditions of the monotheistic world, Judaism, and its descendants, developed in the Levant in the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, shaped in part by the disruption and transformation of the Bronze Age religious landscape. We are, in ways more direct than we usually recognize, the heirs of the people who survived the end of the ancient world. The Bronze Age did not simply end and disappear, leaving a clean slate for the Iron Age to write on. It collapsed, and in its collapse it scattered seeds that grew in unexpected directions. The memories preserved in oral tradition became the epics and myths of the subsequent cultures. The technological knowledge of bronze working, even as bronze itself became less central, laid the foundation for the metallurgical advances of the Iron Age. The trade networks, even after their collapse, left behind roots and relationships and knowledge of geography that the Phoenician and Greek and Assyrian merchants of the Iron Age would eventually exploit. The writing traditions of the Bronze Age, even where they disappeared entirely and had to be reinvented, left their mark on the cultures that came after. History does not have clean endings. The Bronze Age collapse is as close to a clean ending as ancient history offers, a moment when an entire interconnected world of civilizations ceased to function within a recognizable time frame. And even here, even in this most dramatic of historical ruptures, the threads of continuity are there for those who look carefully enough. The people survived. The knowledge survived, imperfectly, fragmentarily, transformed beyond easy recognition, but it survived. And from that survival, eventually, came everything that followed. Lie back now, if you have not already. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is the story of an ending, but it is also, looked at from the right angle, the story of a beginning. Everything that came after, the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, the ancient Near Eastern empires of the Iron Age, the Phoenician trading networks that spread the alphabet across the Mediterranean world, all of it grew from the soil of the collapse, from the silence that followed, the burning cities and the empty palaces and the final undelivered letters. The clay tablets of Ugarit are in museums now, carefully preserved and translated and studied by scholars who spend their lives trying to hear what those 3,000-year-old documents are saying. The ruins of Hattusa sit on their Anatolian plateau, massive stone walls still standing in places, the archive of the 1,000 gods waiting in the soil for the next generation of archaeologists to find and read. The Palace of Pylos, the Palace of Nestor, has been excavated and studied, and its tablets decoded. And we know now some of what was happening there in those final desperate weeks before the fire came. We know their world existed. We know it was remarkable. We know it ended. And we are still trying to understand why. That is where we leave the story, not with a clean answer, but with a question that 3,000 years of time have not diminished. A mystery preserved in the ash and clay of a civilization that burned and was forgotten and was rediscovered and is still, patiently, telling us what it can about what it was and what it lost and what, against all odds, it managed to pass forward into the silence of the centuries. The sea is quiet now over the site of Ugarit. The plateau of Hattusa catches the Anatolian wind. The olive groves of the Peloponnese grow over the ruins of the Mycenaean world. And somewhere in the ground, more tablets are waiting, more evidence of lives lived in a world that ended, more clues to a mystery that may never be fully solved. The Bronze Age sleeps beneath our feet, patient and silent, giving up its secrets one fragment at a time. Let that thought carry you, if it will. Let the weight of 3,000 years and the distance of the ancient world settle into something like rest. The people of Ugarit and Pylos and Hattusa are at peace, as much as anyone across that distance can be said to be at peace. Their story is incomplete, and it will remain incomplete. But we have heard enough of it to understand that they lived fully in their world, that their world was worth living in, and that what ended it was not their failure, but the fragility of the extraordinary thing they had built together. That is not a tragic ending. It is a human one. And 3,000 years later, their successors are still here, still trying to understand, still finding meaning in the asking. Rest now. The ancient world has earned its silence. And so, perhaps, have you. But the story is not quite finished. There is more to sit with, more to understand, more to let wash over you in the quiet of this hour. The Bronze Age collapse is not a story that can be told in one pass. It is a story with layers, like the tells of the ancient cities themselves, each layer of understanding built on the one beneath it, each pass through the evidence, revealing something that was hidden before. So let us go deeper. Let us spend more time in the world that was. Let us begin again, in a sense, from a different angle. Let us begin not with the great powers, or the trade networks, or the palace economies, but with something smaller. Let us begin with a letter. In the winter of 1887, an Egyptian woman who was digging for sebak, the rich organic soil of ancient ruins that Egyptian farmers used as fertilizer, found something unusual in the ground near the village of Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt. What she found, and what her neighbors and eventually dealers in antiquities began to extract from the site over the following months, were clay tablets. Hundreds of clay tablets, written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of Mesopotamia. The tablets made their way through the antiquities market, many of them damaged or broken in the careless process of their extraction, before scholars began to understand what they were looking at. What they were looking at was the diplomatic archive of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had moved his capital to Tel El Amarna and who had ruled Egypt for roughly 17 years in the 14th century BC. The Amarna letters, as they came to be called, are one of the most extraordinary collections of ancient documents ever found. They consist of roughly 382 tablets, most of them letters written to the pharaoh from the rulers of other states, and they open a window into the international relations of the Late Bronze Age that is unlike anything else that has survived. Reading the Amarna letters is to eavesdrop on the diplomatic conversations of a world that was, at the time they were written, at something very close to its height of power and sophistication. The letters are addressed from a range of correspondence. There are letters from the great kings, the rulers of roughly equal power who addressed the pharaoh as brother and expected to be addressed in return with the same title, a term denoting equality in the carefully calibrated diplomatic language of the period. These great kings included the ruler of Babylon, the ruler of Assyria, the ruler of Mitanni, the great Hurrian kingdom of northern Syria and Mesopotamia that was in this period still a significant power, though it would not survive much longer, and the ruler of the Hittites, who in the generation of the Amarna letters was still in the process of building the empire that would make Hatti one of the two great powers of the following century. There are also letters from the vassal rulers of the Levantine city-states, the mayors and kings of small cities in Canaan and Syria who were nominally under Egyptian suzerainty, who wrote to the pharaoh in the obsequious, self-abasing language of those addressing a superior. These vassal letters are full of phrases like 7 times 7, at the feet of my lord, I fall, and they tell stories of local conflicts and rivalries and appeals for Egyptian military assistance, complaints about enemies and neighbors, requests for garrison troops and gold, protests of loyalty, and occasional passive-aggressive observations about the inadequacy of the pharaoh's response to previous correspondence. But it is the letters from the great kings that are in some ways the most revealing, because they show us the workings of Bronze Age international diplomacy with a candor and specificity that official inscriptions and public monuments never could. The great kings wrote to the pharaoh as genuine equals, and their letters reflect the full complexity of relationships between equals. The bargaining and the flattery and the genuine warmth and the barely concealed irritation and the careful management of mutual interest and mutual suspicion. The king of Babylon writes to complain that the gold statues the pharaoh had sent as a gift were not solid gold, but merely gold-plated. He acknowledges that gold is said to be as dust in Egypt, and he wonders why, if this is so, the pharaoh cannot send more and better quality gold. There is a note of genuine offense in the letter, the offense of a man who feels he has not been treated with the respect his position deserves, mixed with the pragmatic concern of a ruler who wants more gold and is trying to shame his counterpart into providing it. The king of Mitanni writes asking for more Egyptian gold and also asking the pharaoh to send one of his daughters as a bride for the Mitanni king, in accordance with the Bronze Age custom of cementing diplomatic alliances through royal marriage. The pharaoh's response, when it comes, navigates the tricky question of royal prestige with care. Egyptian pharaohs did not, as a rule, send their daughters to foreign courts, because this would imply an equality that Egyptian ideology did not recognize. The pharaoh suggests instead the alternative of sending a Mitanni princess to Egypt, which maintains the asymmetry while still providing the alliance. These letters, mundane in one sense, concerned with the small coin of diplomatic life, are profound in another sense. They show us that the rulers of the late Bronze Age were not remote and inhuman figures of power. They were people navigating the ordinary difficulties of maintaining relationships under conditions of inequality and uncertainty and competing interest. They worried about being cheated. They worried about being disrespected. They worried about gold and grain and military assistance and the proper conduct of their allies. They wrote letters that contain, even across 3,000 years of translation and cultural distance, recognizably human voices. And what happened to the world those voices inhabited? By the generation after the Amarna letters were written, Mitanni had been absorbed by the Hittites and would eventually disappear entirely. The Babylonian dynasty that had engaged in such careful diplomatic correspondence with Egypt would eventually be disrupted by internal conflict and external pressure. The Levantine city-states, whose vassal rulers had written such elaborate letters to the pharaoh, would be burned and abandoned in the catastrophe of 1200 BC. And Egypt itself, the great power at the center of this diplomatic web, would survive the collapse but in a diminished and transformed state. The Amarna letters are thus a kind of time capsule from the world, just before everything changed. They were written by people who had no idea that the world they inhabited was close to its end. They were concerned with the immediate questions of power and prestige and alliance and gold, questions that must have seemed, in the context of their lives, permanent and fundamental. And within 3 generations of the latest of them, the network of states and relationships they represent had collapsed. There is another site, one we have not yet visited, that deserves our attention in any complete account of the Bronze Age collapse. It is a site in the Eastern Mediterranean that has given archaeologists some of the most dramatic evidence for the nature of the crisis. It is Enkomi, on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus, ancient Alatia, was one of the most important nodes in the Bronze Age network. Its copper mines supplied the raw material that, combined with tin from distant sources, made bronze. The cities of Cyprus, Enkomi, and Kishan, and others, were prosperous, cosmopolitan centers of trade and production. The Cypriot copper industry was not just a local affair, it was the foundation of an international economy. The island maintained close relationships with Egypt, with the Levantine coast, with the Aegean world, with Anatolia. Cypriot pottery has been found at sites across the Eastern Mediterranean, and the artifacts of other cultures have been found at sites across Cyprus, evidence of a trading city that drew in goods from half the known world. Enkomi, the principal city of Bronze Age Cyprus, was in its final phase, a walled city of considerable prosperity, its buildings constructed in a grid plan that reflects careful urban planning, its streets lined with the workshops of craftsmen who produced bronze objects for export and ivory carvings of extraordinary skill and fine ceramics, in the elaborate decorated style that characterized Cypriot production of the period. The excavations at Enkomi have produced a remarkable range of artifacts from its destruction layers, objects that were buried in the ruins or abandoned as their owners fled, objects that tell us something of what the city contained in its final years. The destruction of Enkomi came in the period of the broader crisis, and it came apparently more than once. There is evidence of destruction and partial rebuilding before the final abandonment of the site, suggesting that Cyprus experienced multiple waves of disruption, perhaps multiple raids or migrations, before the city was finally given up. The island as a whole shows a complex pattern of destruction and survival in this period, with some sites abandoned and others continuing in reduced form, with what appears to be a shift in the population of the island as new groups of people, possibly from the Aegean, settled in Cyprus in the aftermath of the initial crisis, bringing with them pottery styles and cultural traditions that had characterized the Mycenaean world. This Aegean migration to Cyprus in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse is one of the most interesting and debated aspects of the period. The evidence for it is partly archaeological, in the form of the new pottery styles that appear in Cyprus in the 12th century BC, and partly textual, in the form of later traditions that recorded memories of refugees from the Greek world settling on Cyprus. If this migration is real, as most scholars now believe it is, it represents one of the most direct ways in which the collapse of the Mycenaean palace culture created new population movements, people from the destroyed or abandoned Aegean world seeking new places to live, carrying their cultural traditions with them, and blending those traditions with the cultures they encountered in their new homes. Cyprus, then, is a place where we can see in the archaeological record not just the destruction of the old world, but the tentative beginnings of something new, a world in transition, painful and disorienting, but not without its own kind of creativity. The new cultures that developed in Cyprus in the Iron Age were hybrid cultures, blending Aegean and Levantine and indigenous Cypriot traditions in ways that produce something genuinely novel. Let us go now to a place in the narrative that historians often underemphasize, perhaps because the evidence for it is so scattered and indirect. Let us think about what it was like to be an ordinary person during the Bronze Age collapse. The scribes who wrote the clay tablets we have been reading were not ordinary people. They were among the most educated and specialized members of their societies, trained from childhood in the difficult arts of reading and writing. The kings and diplomatic officials who composed the letters we have been quoting were among the most powerful people in their world. But the late Bronze Age world contained, for every scribe and every king, thousands and tens of thousands of people whose lives were not recorded in tablets and whose names are not preserved in any document. The farmers who grew the grain that the palace economies managed. The sailors who crewed the merchant ships that carried copper and tin and textiles across the sea. The craftsmen who worked in the palace workshops producing bronze tools and ivory carvings and fine pottery. The women who processed the wool into textiles in the textile workshops that the Pylos tablets record in such detail. The soldiers who fought the palace wars. The servants who maintained the palace buildings. The traders who moved goods along overland routes between cities. What did the collapse mean for these people? The evidence allows us only glimpses, but those glimpses are important. For the farmers, the climate deterioration that scholars now identify as one of the contributing factors to the collapse would have been experienced in the most immediate and visceral terms. Harvests failing, fields that had yielded abundantly for generations producing less and less. The animals dying for lack of fodder. The grain stores running low and then running out. The Bronze Age palace economies had managed agricultural surplus with great sophistication, using the surplus of good years to buffer against the shortfalls of bad ones, redistributing food from areas of abundance to areas of need, maintaining the population through the ordinary fluctuations of agricultural production. But when the bad years came one after another, when the drought persisted not for a season but for years, the buffer was exhausted, and the people at the bottom of the system, the farmers and agricultural workers, who were already living close to the margin of subsistence, were the first to run out of food. For the sailors and maritime merchants, the collapse meant the disappearance of the trade networks that had given their lives meaning and provided their livelihoods. A merchant sailor in Ugarit in the early 13th century BC operated in a world of established relationships and known routes and understood conventions of trade. He knew where the copper came from and where it went. He knew the prices and the protocols and the people. He had relationships with merchants in Cyprus and Egypt and the Aegean. And then, within a generation, those relationships became unreliable. The routes became dangerous. The partners stopped responding. The trade dried up. What does a merchant sailor do when the system that gave his work its meaning ceases to exist? He finds other work, or he turns to raiding, or he migrates, or he dies. Many of them probably did all of those things. For the craftsmen in the palace workshops, the collapse meant the end of the system that had fed them and employed them and given them the materials they needed to work. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age maintained large numbers of specialized craftsmen by providing them with rations, with raw materials, and with a market for their products in the form of palace consumption and export trade. When the palace stopped functioning, The craftsmen lost their raw materials and their markets simultaneously. The ivory carvers and the bronze smiths and the faience workers and the textile producers, who had specialized in producing luxury goods for palace consumption, found themselves without either supply or demand for their skills. Some of those skills must have survived, passed from parents to children in reduced and simplified forms, adapted to the smaller and simpler world of the early Iron Age. Others were lost, techniques that no one could practice without the materials and the market that only the palace could provide. For the palace scribes themselves, the collapse meant the end of their world in a particularly complete way. The scribes were trained from childhood in skills that were essential to the functioning of the palace economy, but that had no obvious application outside it. They knew how to write. They knew how to manage accounts. They knew how to compose diplomatic correspondence. They knew the conventions of palace administration, and when the palace ceased to exist, so did the demand for those skills. Some scribes may have found work in the smaller administrations of the communities that survived. Others may have passed their knowledge to their children without those children having any place to apply it, until eventually the knowledge died out for lack of use. In the Mycenaean world, the Linear B scribal tradition died so completely that it left no descendant. The Greeks who rebuilt their world in the Iron Age did not know, or did not need, or did not preserve the script their predecessors had used. They invented, or borrowed from the Phoenicians, a new one. This kind of loss, the loss of specialized knowledge that requires complex institutional support to maintain, is one of the most significant and underappreciated aspects of the Bronze Age collapse. We tend to think of civilizational progress as cumulative, as a process in which knowledge is added to without being subtracted from. The Bronze Age collapse is a reminder that this is not always true. Knowledge can be lost. Skills can disappear. Technologies can regress. The level of administrative and logistical sophistication that the Bronze Age palace economies had achieved was not reached again in the Eastern Mediterranean for several centuries after the collapse. The scale and complexity of production that those economies had maintained was not matched again until the much later emergence of new forms of large-scale organization. It is worth dwelling on one specific example of this kind of knowledge loss, because it illustrates the point with particular clarity. One of the most remarkable things produced in the late Bronze Age was glass. Not the crude early glass of the earliest periods, but sophisticated, highly colored, precisely controlled glass production of a quality that would not be seen again in the region for centuries after the collapse. The glass workshops of the late Bronze Age, particularly those associated with Egypt and with the Levantine coast, produced objects of extraordinary beauty, small vessels and beads and inlays, in brilliant shades of blue and green and yellow and white, objects that required a detailed technical understanding of the chemistry of glassmaking, of the temperature controls needed to achieve specific colors, of the techniques of working molten glass into precise shapes. Some of these objects have survived, and when you see them in museum cases, they are genuinely startling in their sophistication, their colors still vivid after 3,000 years. The techniques that produced these objects were lost in the collapse. The glass workshops that had maintained them ceased to function. The craftsmen who knew how to do this work were scattered or died, and whoever carried their knowledge with them did not carry it into a context where it could be practiced and transmitted. The production of glass at the level of sophistication achieved in the late Bronze Age did not recover in the region for centuries. It is one of the clearest examples of a genuine technological regression, a step backward in human capacity, caused not by any failure of human intelligence or creativity, but by the destruction of the social and economic conditions that had made the technology possible. This is worth sitting with. The people of the early Iron Age, the descendants of the people who had produced those extraordinary glass objects, were not less intelligent or less capable than their ancestors. They were operating in a world that could no longer support the specialization and the trade networks and the palace institutions that glass production of that kind required. They made what they could make with what they had, and gradually, over centuries, as the world rebuilt itself and complexity accumulated again, the capacity for sophisticated glass production returned. But it had to be reinvented or relearned. The specific knowledge of the late Bronze Age workshops was gone, Let us turn now to one of the most debated questions in Bronze Age scholarship, and one of the most important for understanding the collapse. Let us think about the internal dynamics of the Hittite Empire in its final decades, because the fall of the Hittites is in many ways the most dramatic single event in the Bronze Age collapse, and it is also one of the most poorly understood. The Hittite Empire at its height, in the 13th century BC, was a state of enormous power and sophistication. It controlled most of Anatolia, a large portion of northern Syria, and exerted influence over territories beyond its direct control. Its army was one of the most formidable in the ancient world, organized around a core of chariot forces and infantry that had defeated Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh in 1274 BC. Its diplomatic apparatus was sophisticated enough to negotiate the world's first known peace treaty and to maintain complex relationships with states across the eastern Mediterranean. Its administrative system, using the cuneiform script and the Hittite language and a system of law codes and bureaucratic procedures, managed a large and diverse empire of peoples who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. But the Hittite Empire was also vulnerable in ways that are, in retrospect, identifiable in the historical record, even if they were not apparent to those living through them. One of the most significant vulnerabilities was the question of royal succession. The Hittite system of succession was, by ancient standards, relatively complicated and contested. The idea of strict primogeniture, the automatic inheritance of power by the eldest son of the king, was not consistently observed. Multiple members of the royal family could have claims to power. The military and administrative elites had real influence over who became king, and the result was that succession crises, moments of instability, and sometimes violent conflict over who would rule next were a recurring feature of Hittite political life. In the final decades of the Hittite Empire, this succession problem became acute. The later Hittite kings faced not just the external pressures of the general crisis, but also internal conflicts over power. The evidence from the tablets, where it exists, suggests a political atmosphere of increasing instability, of tensions between factions, of a leadership that was not fully in control of either its internal politics or its external challenges. There is also the question of the Hittite Empire's western frontier and its relationship with the Aegean world. The tablets and the archaeological evidence together suggest a complex and sometimes turbulent relationship between the Hittite state and the peoples of Western Anatolia and the Aegean in the generation before the collapse. There are references in Hittite texts to a kingdom called Ahiyawa, which most scholars now identify with the Mycenaean Greeks, the Achaeans of Homer. The relationship between Hatti and Ahiyawa was complicated, sometimes adversarial, sometimes cooperative, always sensitive to questions of relative status and power. There are hints in the texts of military conflicts on the western frontier, of defections by Hittite vassals to the Ahiyawa side, of tensions that added to the pressures the empire was managing. When the crisis of around 1200 BC came, the Hittite Empire faced it from a position already weakened by internal succession conflicts and frontier instability. The combination of external pressure from the peoples the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, whatever their actual origin, and internal political fragility, combined with the climate stress that was reducing agricultural surpluses across the region, proved fatal. The empire that had stood against Egypt, that had negotiated the Treaty of Kadesh, that had controlled most of Anatolia for centuries, collapsed. Hattusa, the capital, was burned. The Hittite great king, whoever he was in those final years, left no record of his fate. The empire simply ended. What happened to the Hittites as a people? This is one of the more interesting questions in the aftermath of the collapse. Some survived and maintained something of their cultural traditions in a reduced form. There are what scholars call the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, small city-states in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria that maintained Hittite cultural and linguistic traditions in the Iron Age, centuries after the fall of the empire. These Neo-Hittite states eventually came into conflict with the rising power of Assyria and were absorbed by it in the 9th and 8th centuries BC. But they testify to a kind of cultural survival, a continuation of Hittite identity even after the political structure of the empire had been destroyed. There is also the question of what happened to the Hittite population of central Anatolia after the destruction of Hattusa. The great plateau where Hattusa had stood did not simply empty of people. The region continued to be inhabited, though with a dramatically reduced level of settlement and cultural complexity. Eventually, new peoples moved into the region, including the Phrygians, who built their own kingdom in Anatolia in the Iron Age, and whose culture was later absorbed in turn by the Persians and then the Greeks. The Anatolian plateau has been continuously inhabited by human beings for thousands of years, through all the rises and falls of the various political entities that have controlled it, and the people who live there today are in some sense the distant heirs of all of those histories, including the Hittite history that ended in fire around 1180 BC. There is something that we should talk about that sits at the edge of the evidence, something that the texts and archaeology suggest but cannot quite confirm, something that has to do with the psychology of the Bronze Age world in its final years. It is the question of whether the people of this period saw what was coming. It is easy, looking back from our vantage point, to see the Bronze Age collapse as something that should have been visible, at least in outline, to those living through it. The climate was changing, the trade networks were becoming unreliable, the raids were intensifying, the great powers were weakening. Surely someone must have understood what was happening. The honest answer is that probably some people did sense something was deeply wrong, even if they could not articulate it in the terms we use. The final letters from Ugarit, with their urgent requests for help and their warnings about enemy ships, reflect a leadership that understood it was in serious trouble. The palace administrators at Pylos, who were collecting bronze from temples, understood, at some level, that the normal supply chains had broken down and that emergency measures were necessary. The Hittite kings, who were fighting on multiple frontiers simultaneously, understood that their empire was under unprecedented pressure. But understanding that things are wrong is different from understanding the systemic nature of the crisis, the way that the various pressures were interacting and amplifying each other, the fact that the problem was not one that could be solved by winning a battle or negotiating a treaty or managing a local food shortage more efficiently. The Bronze Age leaders, for all their sophistication, did not have the conceptual framework of systemic risk that modern economists and historians have developed. They lived in a world that had been remarkably stable for a very long time, and the mental models they used to understand their situation were models built on that stability. When the crisis came, those models were inadequate to the scale of what was happening. This is one of the deepest and most troubling aspects of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is one that resonates in ways that are worth sitting with quietly. The people who built the late Bronze Age world were not foolish. They were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily capable. They had built a level of civilizational complexity and interconnection that would not be matched for centuries after their world ended, and yet they could not see, or could not respond effectively to, the forces that were destroying them. The very complexity that had made them great had also made them vulnerable in ways they could not fully understand. There is a kind of humility that this should inspire, about the limits of what even very capable and well-organized human societies can perceive and respond to. The Bronze Age world was not destroyed by stupidity or moral failure or weakness of character. It was destroyed by the collision of multiple large-scale forces that exceeded the capacity of even a sophisticated civilization to manage. That is a sobering thought, and it is one that the evidence of the Bronze Age collapse keeps bringing us back to. However many times we try to find a simpler explanation, let us spend some time now with the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians are one of the most important threads connecting the Bronze Age world to the world that came after it, and their story in the aftermath of the collapse is one of resilience and adaptation that is worth understanding. The Phoenicians, as the Greeks came to call the people of the Levantine coastal cities, were in the Bronze Age the inhabitants of cities like Byblos, which had trading connections with Egypt going back to the 3rd millennium BC, and Sidon and Tyre and other ports along the coast of what is now Lebanon. These cities were part of the late Bronze Age network, participants in the trade that connected Egypt to Cyprus, to the Aegean and beyond. They had their own scribal and administrative traditions, and they were connected to the cultural world of Ugarit whose alphabetic script was related to the script the Phoenicians would carry to fame in the Iron Age. When the Bronze Age collapsed, the Phoenician cities were disrupted, as everything in the region was disrupted. But they were not destroyed as completely as Ugarit or the Mycenaean palaces. Byblos continued to have some level of activity. Tyre and Sidon, which would become the most famous of the Phoenician cities in the Iron Age, emerged from the crisis period in a condition that allowed them to rebuild and eventually to thrive. Why did the Phoenician cities survive more intact than some of their contemporaries? Part of the answer may be geographic. The Levantine coast has good natural harbours and access to the resources of both the sea and the mountains of Lebanon, with their famous cedar forests that were among the most valuable timber resources in the ancient world. Part of the answer may be the flexibility of the Phoenician economy, which was oriented more toward trade and less toward the centralized palace economy model that proved so brittle in the crisis. And part of the answer may simply be that the disruptions of the Bronze Age collapse hit different places with different intensity, and the Phoenician cities were among those that were damaged but not destroyed. What the Phoenicians did in the Iron Age is one of the great stories of ancient history. They rebuilt their maritime trade network, adapting it to the new conditions of the post-collapse world, the absence of the Mycenaean market, the reduced capacity of Egypt, the disruption of the old routes and relationships. They found new markets, sailing further west into the Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and eventually colonies along the North African coast and in Spain and in Sicily and Sardinia and elsewhere. They spread their alphabet, the descendant of the Ugaritic and Proto-Sinaitic scripts of the Bronze Age, to the Greeks, and through the Greeks to the Romans, and through the Romans to us. The letters you are using to read these words trace a lineage that runs through the Phoenicians to the Bronze Age scribal traditions of the Levant. The Phoenician achievement in the Iron Age is a demonstration that the Bronze Age collapse, for all its destructiveness, did not end the capacity of human beings to build complex trading networks and maritime civilizations. It disrupted those capacities severely, and it took generations to rebuild them. But the knowledge was not entirely lost. The skills of seamanship and navigation and trade were preserved in reduced and simplified form through the Dark Ages, and when conditions allowed, they were applied again at expanding scale. The Greeks made a parallel recovery. The Greek Dark Ages, as we have noted, were a period of genuine regression in material culture, population, and complexity. But they were not a period of complete cultural death. The oral traditions that eventually produced Homer were being maintained and developed through those centuries. The agricultural skills that had sustained the Mycenaean population were not lost. The knowledge of the sea and of seafaring was preserved. And when the conditions of the early Iron Age allowed a recovery of population and prosperity, the Greeks applied that knowledge in new ways, building the city-state culture that would eventually produce the classical civilization we know from history books. The Greek recovery was also shaped by contact with the surviving cultures of the Near East, particularly the Phoenicians and the Assyrians and the Egyptians. The alphabet the Greeks adopted was Phoenician. The artistic traditions that shaped early Greek art in the geometric period, the period just after the Dark Ages, show strong influences from the Near East. The religious and mythological traditions of the early Greeks, preserved in Homer and Hesiod and the Homeric hymns, show connections to Near Eastern mythological traditions that trace back ultimately to the Bronze Age world that had been shared by all these cultures. The recovery of Greece was not a creation from nothing but a rebuilding from fragments, drawing on whatever had survived the collapse and whatever could be learned from the neighbours who had survived it. One of the most important things to understand about the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse is the role of the Assyrians in the reconstruction of Near Eastern civilization. The Assyrian state had roots in the Bronze Age, but its greatest power came in the Iron Age, particularly in the first millennium BC, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire became the dominant military and political force in the Near East. The Assyrians were not major participants in the Bronze Age network at the level of the Hittites or Egyptians, and they were not as severely disrupted by the collapse. In the aftermath of the crisis, as the Hittite Empire disappeared and the Egyptian presence in the Levant faded, the Assyrians began a long process of expansion, that eventually gave them control over most of the former territories of the Bronze Age great powers. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was, in its organization and its scale and its ambition, recognizable as a successor to the Bronze Age imperial tradition. It maintained administrative archives, conducted diplomacy, extracted tribute from subject peoples, and organized large-scale military campaigns with a logistical sophistication that was clearly drawing on the administrative traditions of the Bronze Age empires. The Assyrian scribal and administrative tradition was continuous with the Babylonian and Mesopotamian traditions that had deep Bronze Age roots. In this sense, the Assyrian Empire represents one of the clearest threads of continuity from the Bronze Age world to the Iron Age world, a demonstration that not everything was lost and not everything had to be reinvented. But the Assyrian Empire was also something new. Its military power was, by the standards of the ancient world, extreme. The Assyrian army, with its iron weapons and its siege warfare techniques and its systematic practice of mass deportation of conquered peoples, was more destructive in its operations than the Bronze Age armies had typically been. The Bronze Age great powers had generally sought to maintain their subject states as functioning entities that could provide tribute and manpower. The Assyrians were more willing to simply destroy states that resisted them and to scatter their populations. This made the Assyrian Empire more militarily effective in the short term, but also generated the kind of widespread resentment that eventually contributed to its own dramatic fall in 612 BC. The fall of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, in 612 BC, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sacked and burned the city, is in some respects a structural echo of the Bronze Age collapse. Another moment when a complex imperial state collapsed with dramatic speed, leaving the regions it had controlled in a period of instability and transition. History does not simply repeat itself, but it does have patterns, and the pattern of complex imperial systems reaching their limits and collapsing is one that appears multiple times across the ancient world. Let us turn back, in these final passages, to the question that is perhaps the most immediate and personal aspect of the Bronze Age collapse, the question of what it felt like to live through the end of a world. The evidence for the subjective experience of the collapse is necessarily indirect. The people who lived through it did not leave memoirs or diaries. The tablets that survive are administrative documents, diplomatic letters, religious texts, not personal accounts of experience. But from the administrative and diplomatic evidence, we can reconstruct something of the texture of life in the crisis years. And from that reconstruction, we can begin to imagine, at least in outline, what it might have felt like. Imagine being a merchant in Ugarit in the final decade of the city's existence. You have spent your life in the trade of goods across the eastern Mediterranean. You have connections in Cyprus, in Egypt, in the Aegean, in Anatolia. You know the prices of copper and tin and textiles and grain, the seasonal rhythms of the sailing season, the protocols of doing business with partners from a dozen different cultures. Your livelihood depends on the smooth functioning of a network that has existed in its basic form for generations. And now, suddenly, things are going wrong. The ships that should have come from Mycenae have not come. The messages you sent to your partner in the Aegean have gone unanswered. The news from the north is disturbing. There are stories of cities being burned, of peoples on the move. The grain shipments from Egypt are late and smaller than usual. The price of tin has risen because the routes from the east are unreliable, and there are rumors, becoming more than rumors, of ships appearing offshore at night, of raids on coastal settlements to the north. What do you do with this information? You are not a palace official. You do not have access to the diplomatic correspondence that might give you a clearer picture of the overall situation. You know only what you can see and hear in the markets and taverns of Ugarit, what the sailors arriving from other ports tell you, what the merchants from other cities say when they visit. And what you see and hear is increasingly alarming. The world that you have always relied on is becoming unreliable. The network that has sustained you is fraying. Do you try to adapt? Do you seek new trading partners, new routes, new goods? Do you reduce your risk by keeping more of your assets in the city, less on ships that might not come back? Or do you, at some point, make the decision to leave? to take your family and your portable wealth and go somewhere that seems safer. We do not know the answers to these questions for any specific individual. We know only that many people in Ugarit did leave, because archaeology tells us that the city was not fully populated in its final years, that there had been some departure before the final destruction. And we know that some people stayed, because the ruins contain the evidence of their presence at the moment the city burned. Or imagine being a farmer in the Mycenaean world, in the hinterland behind the palace at Pylos, in the final years of the palace's existence. Your life is organized around the palace economy. The palace takes a portion of your harvest. In return, it provides you with bronze tools, with access to certain resources, with protection. The palace is, in your world, the organizing force of economic and social life. You may not love the palace administration. You may resent the portion of your harvest it takes, the labor obligations it imposes. But it is the world you know, the world your parents knew, the world that has organized life in this region for generations. And now, the harvests are getting worse. The rains are less reliable, your animals are thin, the grain in the storage pits does not last as long as it should. The palace is sending its officials more frequently, checking on the harvest more anxiously, and then you hear that the palace has sent the army away, has mobilized all the available men to go to the Hittite territory. The palace itself is fortifying, collecting bronze from the temples. The watchers on the coast are reporting strange ships. Do you feel fear? Of course you do. Do you understand what is happening? Probably not, in any systematic sense. You understand that things are going wrong. You understand that the palace, which has always seemed so powerful and so permanent, seems now to be afraid of something. And you understand, with the practical wisdom of a farmer who has spent a lifetime reading the signs of the land, that this year's harvest will not be enough, and that next year's may not be either, and that the system that has always been there to buffer against bad harvests is, for the first time in memory, failing. What do? Do you hide grain from the palace officials? Do you make contact with neighbors in other villages, beginning to build the local networks that will sustain you when the palace is gone? Do you simply wait and hope? We do not know. We have only the archaeology of what came after, the evidence of reduced settlements and simpler material culture, and the absence of the palace records that had managed your life. From that evidence, we know that people survived. We know that communities persisted. We know that the Bronze Age farmers of the Mycenaean world became the Iron Age farmers of the Greek Dark Ages, smaller and poorer and less connected, but alive, maintaining themselves and their communities in the wreckage of the world the palace had organized. This is the final and most important thing to understand about the Bronze Age collapse. For all its scale, for all its comprehensiveness, for all the dramatic and total nature of the destruction it wrought on the organized structures of the late Bronze Age world, it did not end human life in the Eastern Mediterranean. It did not even end, in most places, continuous human occupation. The land went on being farmed, the sea went on being sailed, communities went on being maintained, children went on being born and raised and taught what their parents knew. The thread of human life, the most fundamental thread of all, was not broken. The loss was real, and it was immense. The knowledge that was lost, the skills that were lost, the social and economic complexity that was lost, these were genuine human achievements that it took centuries to rebuild, and in some cases, that were never quite rebuilt in the same form. The scribes of Pylos never came back. The Hittite Empire never came back. Ugarit never came back. The Bronze Age world, that extraordinary interconnected network of palace economies and long-distance trade, never came back in the same form. But something else did come back, and something new was built, and the world we live in now is in some sense the distant heir of both the Bronze Age world that ended and the Iron Age world that eventually emerged from its ashes. The alphabet we use, the political concepts we have inherited, the religious traditions that shape even the most secular aspects of our culture, the mythological stories that have been adapted and readapted through the millennia, all of these trace genealogies that pass through the catastrophe of 1200 BC and emerge, changed and reshaped on the other side. The Bronze Age collapse is, in the end, a story about the fragility of the things human beings build and about the persistence of the human beings who build them. The palaces fell, the trade networks collapsed, the writing systems disappeared, and the people, or enough of them, went on. They carried forward what they could carry. They forgot what could not be carried. They built new things from the fragments of the old, and from the resources of the new world they found themselves in. They were not the same people, in any meaningful cultural sense, as the people of the Late Bronze Age, but they were people, with the same fundamental human capacities for creativity and adaptation and community and meaning-making. And from that, eventually, everything else followed. The stars that were visible from the palace rooftops of Mycenae and Hattusa and Ugarit are visible still. The sea that carried the Bronze Age merchant ships still stretches across the same Mediterranean basin, its currents following the same patterns, its seasonal rhythms still governing the sailing season. The land that the Bronze Age farmers worked still produces grain and olives and grapes, the same crops, nourished by the same soil that their labor enriched. The bronze objects that the craftsmen made, buried in the ground of the destroyed cities for 3,000 years, are being brought out of that ground still, passed from hand to hand in museums, studied and analyzed and wondered at. The Bronze Age world is gone, but it is not entirely gone. It is present in the things it left behind, in the clay tablets and bronze objects and architectural ruins and pollen records and isotope ratios that are still telling its story to those who know how to read them. And it is present, more diffusely, in the long chain of consequences that connects it to us, in the alphabet, and the mythology, and the political concepts, and the agricultural techniques, and the metallurgical knowledge that passed through many transformations, from the Bronze Age world, through the Dark Ages, to the Iron Age, and onward through the centuries to the world we inhabit now. The scribes of Ugarit, and the palace administrators of Pylos, and the diplomats who carried the Amarna letters, did not know that they would one day be studied and wondered at by people living in a world they could not have imagined. They did not know that their clay tablets would survive the fires that consumed everything else and lie in the ground for 3,000 years before being found and read. They did not know that their careful records of grain rations and bronze stockpiles and diplomatic gifts would one day be the evidence historians use to reconstruct their world. They knew only their world, as we know only ours. They were doing the work of their time, in the way that seemed best to them, with the tools and knowledge they had. And when their world ended, they could not have known that it would be remembered. They could not have known that the silence following the burning of their cities would eventually be broken by the patient work of archaeologists and linguists and paleoclimatologists, building, fragment by fragment, the most detailed picture of their world that we can achieve. We owe them something for that. We owe them the attention we are paying, the effort to understand, the willingness to sit with the mystery of what happened to them and why. Not because the Bronze Age collapse has lessons to teach in any simple or direct sense. Not because we can save ourselves from similar fates by studying this one, but because they were people, real people, who lived and worked and worried and hoped and built extraordinary things and lost them, and because the act of trying to understand their lives is itself a form of the human solidarity that makes civilization possible in the first place. The lights of the ancient cities are out. The tablets are in museums. The ruins are in the care of archaeologists. And the story, 3,000 years old, is still being told, still being refined, still yielding new details and new questions, and new reasons to marvel at the world that was built, and the world that ended, and the world that came after. The Bronze Age collapse. What really ended the ancient world? Perhaps the truest answer is this. The ancient world ended because it was built by human beings, and human beings build things that are magnificent and fragile and mortal, just as they are themselves. And then, because they are human beings, they build again. Rest now. Let the distance of 3,000 years and the weight of all that has been said settle into the quiet of wherever you are. The mystery is not solved. It may never be fully solved, but it has been held and examined and passed on as all good mysteries should be. And somewhere in the layers of the earth, another tablet is waiting to be found, another fragment of the world that was patient in its darkness, ready to say one more thing when the time comes. The sea is calm tonight over the ancient harbors. The stars are out, and the world that ended 3,000 years ago rests, as it always has, in the careful keeping of the ground. There is still more of this world to explore. The story of the Bronze Age collapse has threads that reach into corners we have not yet visited, into discoveries that archaeologists are still making in our own time, into debates that scholars are still having in the journals and conference rooms of the modern academy. The mystery, as all great mysteries do, keeps revealing new chambers the further in you go. Let us think, for a while, about what the collapse looked like from the perspective of the people who were actually raiding the Eastern Mediterranean in this period. We have spent considerable time with the victims of the raids, with the inhabitants of Ugarit and Pylos and Hattusa, who found themselves on the wrong end of what was coming. But the people who were moving, the people whom the Egyptian inscriptions called the Sea Peoples, were themselves human beings, with their own histories and their own motivations and their own understanding, however limited, of what they were doing and why. The evidence we have for the Sea Peoples comes almost entirely from their enemies. The Egyptian inscriptions describe them from the perspective of a state that was defending itself against them. The burned cities of the Levant speak to their destructiveness without telling us who they were or what drove them. We have no Sea Peoples archive, no tablet collection from the other side of this historical encounter. Everything we know about them is filtered through the records of the societies they disrupted, and those records are naturally not sympathetic. But if we take seriously the interpretation that the Sea Peoples were in large part refugees, people displaced from their homelands by the same droughts and political disruptions that were stressing the entire Eastern Mediterranean, then we begin to see them differently. We begin to see not simply raiders and destroyers, but populations in desperate movement, people who had lost their homes and their livelihoods and their food supply, and who were doing what human beings have always done in such circumstances, moving toward resources that might sustain them, taking by force what they could not obtain by trade or negotiation, driven by the fundamental imperative of survival. This does not excuse the destruction they caused. The people of Ugarit and of the Levantine coastal cities did not deserve to have their homes burned and their lives disrupted by populations descending on them from the north and west. The suffering of the victims of the raids was real, and we should not minimize it. But understanding the Sea Peoples as refugees, rather than simply as aggressors, helps us see the Bronze Age collapse as a more fully human story, a story in which there were not simply victims and perpetrators, but multiple populations, all caught in the same systemic crisis, all trying to survive in circumstances that none of them had chosen, and none of them fully understood. The movement of peoples that characterized the end of the Bronze Age was, in this sense, itself a symptom of the collapse, rather than simply a cause of it. The raids and migrations were generated by the same pressures that were destroying the palace economies: the climate stress, the disruption of trade, the failure of the systems that had sustained populations across the region. And the raids, in turn, made the collapse worse, accelerating the breakdown of the remaining trading networks, destroying cities that might otherwise have survived the primary crisis, generating new waves of refugees who would in turn displace and disrupt communities further along. This is the cascade dynamic at the heart of the Bronze Age collapse. Each disruption generated further disruptions. Each failure made further failures more likely. Each group of people displaced by one aspect of the crisis became, in their turn, a source of displacement for others. The system that had seemed so stable and so permanent revealed itself, under sufficient stress, to be a web of interdependencies so tightly woven that when enough threads broke, the whole fabric could not hold. Let us take a moment to think about a specific archaeological discovery that illuminates the end of the Bronze Age in an unusually direct and intimate way. In 1982, underwater archaeologist George Bass and his team from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology began excavating a shipwreck that had been found near the Turkish coast at a site called Uluburun. The wreck, which dates to approximately 1300 BC, proved to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the century, not because of its age, though it is extraordinary for its age, but because of what it contained. The Uluburun ship was a merchant vessel, and it was fully loaded when it sank. The excavation of its cargo produced a picture of late Bronze Age trade that is, in its specificity and its richness, unlike anything else that has survived from this period. The ship's hold contained 10 tons of copper ingots, in the distinctive ox-hide shape characteristic of late Bronze Age copper production. It contained 1 ton of tin ingots, the tin that would have been combined with the copper to make bronze. It contained Canaanite jars containing terebinth resin, used as incense and for other purposes. It contained logs of ebony from Africa. It contained ostrich eggs. It contained ivory, both African elephant ivory and hippopotamus ivory. It contained glass ingots, blue and lavender and turquoise, the raw material for glass production. It contained gold and silver objects. It contained bronze tools and weapons. It contained Mycenaean pottery. It contained Canaanite pottery. It contained a gold scarab inscribed with the name of Nefertiti, the Egyptian queen, which may have been a diplomatic gift or a high-value trade item. It contained a diptych, a hinged writing board, which would have had wax surfaces for writing on, an extremely rare survival of the kind of everyday writing material that would have been used alongside the more durable clay tablets. The Uluburun ship is, in other words, a cross-section of the late Bronze Age trade network, a single moment frozen in the wreck of a vessel that was carrying the goods of multiple cultures across the Mediterranean Sea. Reading the cargo list is to encounter the Bronze Age world in its most concrete and tangible form, to see what was actually moving across the water, what the trade was actually made of, what connected Egypt and Cyprus and the Levant and the Aegean in the practical, day-to-day reality of Bronze Age commerce. And the ship, we must remember, sank a century or more before the collapse. The network it was part of was still functioning, still producing voyages like this one, still moving 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin and African ebony and glass ingots and gold Egyptian scarabs across the Mediterranean. All of that would end within a century. The network that produced the Uluburun ship would be broken by the same forces that burned Ugarit and destroyed the Mycenaean palaces. But in the moment when it was making this voyage, it was an extraordinary achievement of human organization and aspiration, a demonstration of how far human beings had come in their capacity to connect distant places and to move the resources of one region to the needs of another. The Uluburun shipwreck is now one of the most visited exhibits at the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology in Turkey, and the careful recreation of its cargo and the meticulous study of its construction have given us knowledge of late Bronze Age seafaring that no text could have provided. We can see the actual wood that the ship was built from, the actual ropes and rigging, the actual cargo with its weights and dimensions and origins. We can measure the scale of the copper trade. We can see where the glass ingots were made and where they were going. We can feel, in a way that is almost physical, the weight and the substance of the Bronze Age economy, its materiality, its reality as a functioning system built on actual things, being moved by actual ships, crewed by actual people. All of this was less than a century from its end when the Uluburun ship went down. There is another discovery made in the modern era that deserves to be mentioned in any account of our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse. It is not a single site or a single object, but a methodology, a new way of extracting information from the physical evidence of the past. The methodology is called stable isotope analysis, and it has revolutionized archaeologists' ability to understand ancient trade networks and population movements. The basic principle of stable isotope analysis is that the chemical composition of certain elements in the body, particularly in teeth and bones, varies depending on the geographic location where a person or animal lived and ate during the period when those tissues were forming. Teeth form in childhood and then remain essentially unchanged throughout a person's life, so the isotopic signature in a person's teeth reflects where they lived as a child. If you then find that person's skeleton at an archaeological site and analyze the isotopic signature of their teeth, you can determine whether they were native to the region where they were buried or whether they had moved there from somewhere else. This technique has been applied to the burial populations at various Bronze Age sites, and the results have been illuminating in ways that bear directly on questions about the collapse. At sites where the Bronze Age population shows a sudden change in isotopic signature in the layers just before or during the collapse period, this may indicate the arrival of new populations from different geographic regions, consistent with the migrations and displacements that the textual evidence suggests. The technique is still being refined and applied, and the results have to be interpreted carefully, but it represents exactly the kind of new methodology that continues to advance our understanding of the period. Similarly, ancient DNA analysis, which has become increasingly powerful in recent years, is beginning to be applied to Bronze Age populations. By extracting and analyzing genetic material from ancient human remains, researchers can now track population movements with a precision that was impossible even a decade ago. The genetic picture of the late Bronze Age and the transition to the Iron Age is still being assembled, but it is already producing results that both confirm and complicate the picture that archaeology and historical texts have given us. We are in the early stages of a revolution in our ability to understand ancient population history, and the Bronze Age collapse is one of the periods where this revolution is likely to produce the most significant new insights. What we can say, with confidence, based on all the evidence available, is that the Bronze Age collapse was a real event, not a gradual decline or a historiographical construct, but a genuine and dramatic disruption that occurred within a relatively short time frame across a large region. The convergence of evidence from archaeology, from paleoclimatology, from the analysis of ancient texts, and increasingly from the new scientific techniques being applied to ancient remains, all points in the same direction. Something went seriously and comprehensively wrong in the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, and the world that emerged from the crisis was dramatically different from the world that preceded it. What we cannot say with confidence is exactly what, in what sequence, caused what. The relative weights to assign to drought, to the Sea People's raids and migrations, to internal political instability, to trade disruption, to seismic activity, to internal social tensions, remain genuinely debated. Different scholars weight these factors differently, and the debate is not purely academic. The way we understand the Bronze Age collapse reflects our broader theoretical commitments about how historical change works, about whether great events have single causes or multiple interacting causes, about the role of individuals versus systemic forces in driving historical change, about the relationship between human agency and environmental constraint. These are not merely ancient history questions, they are questions about how we understand the world we live in, about how we think about the risks that complex, interconnected, climate-sensitive civilizations face. The Bronze Age collapse is interesting in the present, not only because it is fascinating in itself, but because it forces us to think carefully about questions that remain, in different forms, live questions for our own time. But let us not overburden the Bronze Age with contemporary anxieties. The late Bronze Age world was not our world. The differences between them are real and significant. We have technologies and knowledge and institutions that the Bronze Age world did not have. We face risks that the Bronze Age world did not face. The analogy between the Bronze Age collapse and any contemporary scenario is always imperfect and potentially misleading. The value of the Bronze Age collapse as a historical case study lies not in its direct applicability, but in what it reveals about the general dynamics of complex systems, dynamics that operate across many different contexts and time periods. There is one more figure in the story of the Bronze Age collapse that deserves a sustained mention, not because he was a king or a general or a major political figure, but because of what he represents in the history of our knowledge of this period. His name is Carl Blegen, and he was an American archaeologist who spent much of his career excavating in Greece, and who, in 1939, made one of the most important discoveries in the archaeology of the Bronze Age. Blegen was working at the site of Ano Englianos in the southwestern Peloponnese, a site that had long been suspected to be the location of the legendary palace of Nestor, the Homeric hero, the wise old king of Pylos. On the very first day of excavation, in 1939, Blegen's team discovered clay tablets inscribed in the still undeciphered Linear B script. It was an extraordinary beginning. The excavation was interrupted by the Second World War, but after the war, Blegan returned and continued his work, eventually revealing the extensive palace complex that we now know as the Palace of Nestor. The tablets he found, more than 1,000 of them, were crucial to the eventual decipherment of Linear B by Michael Ventris in 1952, providing the data that made it possible to crack the code. When Blegan examined the archaeological evidence of the palace's destruction, he found something striking. The fire that destroyed the palace had been intense and comprehensive, hot enough to bake the clay tablets that had been stored in the palace archives, which is why they survived. The fire appears to have burned simultaneously in multiple parts of the palace, suggesting that it was either a deliberate act of destruction or that it burned with a speed and intensity that spread faster than any accidental fire would be expected to. The evidence pointed to deliberate destruction, a burning of the palace by persons unknown. What Blegan found among the last tablets from Pylos was also suggestive. There were records of rowers being levied for service, consistent with the mobilization of naval forces. There were records of watchmen being posted along the coast. There were records of bronze being collected from religious sanctuaries, presumably to be converted into weapons. These were not the records of a palace in normal operation. They were the records of a palace mobilizing for an emergency, and then the palace burned. Blegan's excavations at Pylos gave us the Linear B tablets that allowed us to read about the Bronze Age palace economy in unprecedented detail. They also gave us the most direct archaeological evidence we have for the crisis atmosphere of the final days of a Bronze Age palace, the physical remains of a people who knew something was coming and who were trying to prepare for it. That combination, the detailed record of normal palace life in the tablets, and the evidence of crisis mobilization in the latest tablets, and the evidence of destruction in the burning layers, makes Pylos one of the most important sites for understanding the Bronze Age collapse, a site where we can almost, not quite, but almost, hear the voices of the people who were there. The Palace of Nestor at Pylos is now a protected archaeological site, covered by a modern roof to protect the exposed ruins from the weather, and visitors can walk through the spaces where Bronze Age administrators once worked and where Linear B scribes once bent over their tablets. The columns that once supported the Great Megaron, the central hall of the palace, are gone, but their bases remain, and the floor plans of the rooms are visible, and you can stand in the space where the throne room was and look out through the open walls at the Greek landscape of olive trees and distant hills and the blue shimmer of the sea that the Bronze Age fleet sailed from this place. The sea that carried the merchant ships and the warships and the refugee boats and the raider vessels of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. The sea that is still there, still carrying its ships, still connecting the lands around it as it has connected them since before human memory. The Bronze Age ended. But the sea remained, and in the archaeology of 1,000 sites, in the translations of clay tablets written by people who have been dead for 3,000 years, in the chemical signatures preserved in the teeth of people who moved across that ancient world and whose movements we are only now beginning to read, in the pollen preserved in the sediments of lakes that dried up and filled again over the centuries, in the isotopes locked in cave formations that recorded every change in the rainfall of the ancient Mediterranean. In all of these things, the Bronze Age world is still speaking to us, not loudly, not clearly, not in the full-throated voice it would have had when the palaces were standing and the ships were sailing and the tablets were being written, but speaking nonetheless, in fragments and whispers and the careful reconstruction of patient scholars who have devoted their lives to hearing what the ground is trying to say. And we are listening. That is what matters. Across all the distance of time and language and cultural difference, we are still listening to the voices of the Bronze Age. We are still trying to understand what they built and what they lost and what ended their world. And in that listening, in that sustained attempt to understand, there is something that connects us to them across the full depth of the past, something that makes the 3,000 years between us feel, at certain moments, like less than it is. The tablets of Ugarit are still being studied. New fragments are still being found and translated. The excavations at Hattusa have never entirely stopped, and new discoveries continue to emerge from the Anatolian plateau. The submerged sites of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, places where coastal communities were swallowed by the sea or where ships sank carrying their cargoes to the bottom, continue to yield new evidence to the underwater archaeologists who work there. The pollen cores and the cave speleothems and the ancient DNA samples continue to be analysed in laboratories around the world, producing new data points in the ongoing reconstruction of what the ancient world was like and what happened to it. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not finished. It will not be finished in our lifetimes. It is an ongoing investigation, a sustained scholarly conversation that has been proceeding for more than a century and that continues to produce new questions even as it produces new answers. The mystery at the heart of it, the question of what really ended the ancient world, remains open, and it will remain open, yielding always some new insight, but never quite resolving into the clean and certain explanation that we always hope for when we engage with a historical question of this magnitude. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps a mystery of this scale and this significance deserves to remain, at its core, a mystery. The Bronze Age world was too complex, too multifaceted, too fully human in all its richness and its vulnerability to be explained in any single formula. It was a world of real people doing real things for reasons that were sometimes comprehensible and sometimes not, building something extraordinary and losing it to forces that were larger than any of them, surviving and dispersing and adapting and eventually building again, differently, in the silence and the ruins. We are their heirs, and we are still telling their story. We are still, 3,000 years later, trying to understand what ended their world and what it means that it ended and what survived the ending. That sustained human attention, that refusal to let the question go, that insistence on trying to hear even the faintest whisper from the ground where their cities stood, is itself a kind of tribute to the people of the Bronze Age. Not a monument made of stone, but something perhaps more durable, an ongoing act of remembrance by people who were born millennia too late to have known them, but who refused to let them be entirely forgotten. The Bronze Age ended. The world that came after it was different, and in some ways lesser, and in some ways new. And then the world after that came, and the world after that, each one building on and departing from what came before, until eventually we arrived at this moment, at this telling of a very old story to people who are listening in the dark, letting the weight of 3,000 years of history settle into the quiet space of the night. The ancient world ended, but here, still, in the act of remembering it, it persists. And so does the night, and the quiet, and the long slow drift towards sleep, and all the dreams that carry us, as dreams always have, to places we could not otherwise reach. Let the tablets rest in their museums. Let the ruins sleep under their Anatolian sky. Let the sea keep its secrets and yield its wrecks one at a time to the patient archaeologists who are looking for them. Let the Bronze Age have its silence now, the silence it has earned across 30 centuries, and let you have yours. But sleep, when it comes on a night like this one, does not always arrive at once. Sometimes it approaches slowly, in stages, like the tide coming in. And in those slow stages, there is time for more of the story, more of the world that was. So let us keep going. Let us follow one more thread, and then another, until the dark is full enough and the story has said what it has to say. We have spoken much of the destruction. Let us speak now, for a while, of the making. Let us speak of the craftsmen and the artists of the late Bronze Age, because what they made deserves its own telling, and because understanding the quality of what was lost helps us understand the magnitude of what the collapse meant. The late Bronze Age was, by any measure, a period of extraordinary artistic and technical achievement. The objects produced in this period, the ones that have survived, are not primitive or crude. They are, in many cases, among the finest objects ever made. Distinguished not just by the skill that went into their production, but by the aesthetic sensibility that shaped their design, a sensibility that was sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and capable of extraordinary refinement. Consider the gold objects. The late Bronze Age goldsmiths of the Aegean world produced work of breathtaking quality, work that has never been surpassed in the history of goldsmithing for the sheer intricacy and confidence of its execution. The gold death masks, found by Heinrich Schliemann at Mycenae in 1876, including the famous Mask of Agamemnon, though it dates slightly earlier than the Trojan War period Schliemann associated it with, are extraordinary objects, beaten from a single sheet of gold, with such skill that the features of a human face are rendered with full three-dimensionality. The gold signet rings of the Aegean world, tiny objects just centimeters across, bear engraved scenes of extraordinary complexity, religious ceremonies, and mythological narratives rendered with a sureness of line and a mastery of miniature scale that seems almost impossible given the tools available. The gold and silver vessels of the period, the cups and rhytons, the ceremonial drinking vessels in the shape of animal heads, are objects that would be remarkable in any period of art history. Or consider the ivory work. Ivory, imported from Africa and from the Syrian elephant populations that still existed in this period, was carved by the craftsmen of the Levantine coast and the Aegean world into objects of extraordinary delicacy and power. Gaming boxes inlaid with ivory and faience, decorative plaques for furniture carved with scenes of hunting and mythology in low relief of great skill, mirror handles in the form of a woman, perhaps a goddess, standing between two goats rearing up on either side, an image of such confident beauty that it stops you cold when you encounter it in a museum case. The ivory carvers of the late Bronze Age were masters of their material, able to render the grain of the ivory and the naturalism of human and animal form with a skill that reflects generations of accumulated craft knowledge. Or the faience. Faience is a glass-like material made from ground quartz coated with a glassy glaze, and in the late Bronze Age it was used to produce objects of vivid colour and considerable technical complexity. The faience workshops of the Aegean and the Levant produced plaques and beads and small figurines in brilliant shades of blue and green and white and yellow, objects that were valued across the entire Bronze Age trade network and that have been found at sites throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The technique of faience production was complex enough that it required specialized knowledge and specialized workshops to sustain, and it was another of the technical skills that was reduced or lost in the aftermath of the collapse. And then there is what might be the most extraordinary artistic achievement of the Aegean Bronze Age, the palace frescoes. The walls of the Mycenaean palaces and of the Minoan palaces of Crete that preceded and influenced them were covered in painted plaster frescoes of great skill and vitality. The frescoes at Knossos on Crete, the great Minoan palace that was the center of Aegean civilization before the rise of the Mycenaeans, show bull-leaping scenes of athletic dynamism, processions of gift-bearers in elaborate costumes, dolphins and flowers and marine life rendered with a freshness and a joy in the natural world that seems to leap across the centuries. The frescoes at Mycenae and Tiryns and other Mycenaean sites, while somewhat different in character, show a similar confidence and skill in the rendering of human figures, animals, and complex ceremonial scenes. Very little of these frescoes survives intact. The fires that destroyed the palaces also destroyed the painted plaster walls, leaving at best fragments, some of them tiny, that have to be carefully assembled like jigsaws by archaeologists who have spent careers working on single fragments of painted plaster. The reconstructions in the museums, the assembled fragments of fresco glued back to approximations of their original positions, give us some sense of what the original must have looked like. But the originals themselves are gone. The fires that ended the palaces also ended the visual world the frescoes had created. This is a loss that is in some ways harder to quantify than the loss of the administrative tablets or the diplomatic archives, because the frescoes did not record information. They created experience. They created beauty. They were the artistic expression of a culture's sense of itself and its world, and when they burned, that expression was silenced. The culture that created them left no artistic descendants, no tradition that carried on from where the palace frescoes left off. The Greek art of the early Iron Age, the geometric style that characterizes the period just after the Dark Ages, is entirely different in character, reduced and schematized, working with a visual vocabulary of triangles and circles and simplified human figures that bears no obvious stylistic relationship to the confident naturalism of the Mycenaean frescoes. The tradition was broken. the visual language had to be reinvented. This reinvention was itself a creative achievement, and the geometric style has its own austere beauty. But it is a reminder, once again, that the collapse was not simply a political and economic event. It was a cultural catastrophe, an ending of traditions and techniques and visual languages that had been developed over centuries and that did not survive the burning of the palaces where they had been practiced. Let us spend a little time in the world of Bronze Age religion, because the religious life of these cultures is another window into what was lost and what survived the collapse. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was a world of great religious complexity and richness, a world where multiple traditions coexisted and influenced each other, where the boundaries between the divine and the human were understood in ways that were both different from our own and surprisingly recognizable. The Hittites, as we have noted, worshipped what they called the 1,000 gods of Hatti, a remarkable acknowledgement of religious pluralism within the imperial context. The Hittite Empire absorbed the religious traditions of the peoples it conquered, incorporating their gods into the official pantheon rather than suppressing them, recognizing that the divine landscape was as diverse as the human landscape. The great rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya, near Hattusa, preserves carved reliefs of the Hittite divine assembly, dozens of gods marching in procession, male and female deities, distinguished by their clothing and their symbols, a visual representation of the extraordinary religious complexity of the Hittite world. Some of these deities are recognizably Hittite. Others show Hurrian influence. Others show Mesopotamian influence. The divine assembly at Yazilikaya is a visual record of the cultural synthesis of the Hittite Empire, a synthesis that was destroyed along with the empire that had created it. The religion of the Mycenaean world is known to us partly through the Linear B tablets, which contain references to divine names that are recognizable as early forms of the later Greek gods. The gods of the tablets include figures we know from classical Greek religion: Zeus, Hera, Athena, Poseidon, Dionysus, Artemis, and others. This continuity of divine names is one of the most striking threads connecting the Mycenaean world to the classical world that came after it. Evidence that even though the palace culture was destroyed and the writing system was lost, some elements of religious tradition survived in the oral traditions that eventually produced classical Greek mythology. But the religion of the Mycenaean world was not simply an early version of classical Greek religion. It was something distinct, a palace religion centered on the ritual activities of the palace itself, with the religious and the administrative functions of the palace deeply intertwined. The Linear B tablets record offerings to the gods in the same administrative language and format used to record grain rations and bronze stockpiles. Religion in the Mycenaean world was, in part, a function of the palace economy, managed by the palace officials and directed toward the maintenance of divine favor for the palace enterprise. When the palace collapsed, this form of religious practice collapsed with it, and what survived was something different, more decentralized, more community-based, the seeds of the very different religious culture of the subsequent Greek world. The religion of Ugarit is known to us through the mythological texts in the Ugarit archive, texts that tell stories of the Canaanite gods with a vividness and a dramatic power that make them among the most fascinating religious literature of the ancient world. The stories of Baal, the storm god, and his battles against the sea god Yam and the death god Mot. The stories of El, the father of the gods, and his divine council. The stories of Asherah, the mother goddess, and her role in the divine family. All of these are told in the Ugarit texts, with a narrative sophistication that reflects a developed literary tradition. And these stories have connections to the religious traditions of the Hebrew Bible that scholars have been tracing since the Ugarit archive was first deciphered, connections that suggest that the mythology of the Bible was shaped in part by the same cultural world that produced the Ugarit texts. The collapse of Ugarit did not mean the complete end of this religious tradition. The Canaanite mythological traditions survived in the Levant, carried forward by the communities that persisted there through and after the crisis period. They influenced the religious development of the ancient Israelites, and through the Israelites, the entire subsequent history of the Abrahamic religious traditions. The god El, whose name appears in the Ugarit texts as the chief of the divine assembly, is also the name used for the God of Israel in many of the oldest passages of the Hebrew Bible. The stories told about the divine council in the Ugarit texts have structural parallels to stories in the Hebrew Bible. These connections are not mere curiosities. They remind us that the religious history of the Western world is not a clean line from a single source, but a braided stream, drawing on the many religious traditions of the ancient Near East, shaped by the same cultural currents that produced the Bronze Age civilization, and by the transformations that the collapse of that civilization set in motion. The religious traditions of the ancient world were, like the material and political traditions, disrupted and transformed by the Bronze Age collapse. Some were lost entirely, others survived in changed form. Others emerged from the crisis transformed into something new, carrying the DNA of the Bronze Age world while responding to the very different conditions of the Iron Age. The religious history of the post-collapse Eastern Mediterranean is, in its way, as complex and fascinating as the political and material history, and it continues to be studied and debated by scholars across multiple disciplines. There is one final aspect of the Bronze Age collapse that deserves mention before we allow the story to settle into its final silence. It is the aspect that is perhaps the hardest to discuss, because it is the most speculative and the most emotionally resonant. It is the question of what the people of the late Bronze Age believed about what was happening to them. We know, from the tablets and from the inscriptions, something of the framework through which the people of the late Bronze Age interpreted the world. They lived in a world that was, for them, thoroughly inhabited by divine forces. The natural phenomena that we understand through science, the droughts and earthquakes and storms that contributed to the collapse, were not, for them, simply natural. They were the expression of divine will, the signs of the god's approval or displeasure, the language in which the divine communicated with the human world. A prolonged drought, in this framework, was not simply a climatic event. It was a sign that something was wrong in the relationship between human beings and the divine, that the proper rituals had not been performed, or that some transgression had occurred that required divine response. The Hittite texts, particularly the so-called plague prayers of the Hittite king Mycenaean II, who ruled in the 14th century BC, give us a remarkable window into how a Bronze Age king understood a crisis in terms of divine relationship. Mycenaean's kingdom was suffering from a devastating plague that killed tens of thousands of people over 2 decades, and his prayers to the gods to end the plague are among the most human and moving documents in all of ancient literature. He acknowledges that his people have sinned. He tries to identify exactly what transgression has brought divine punishment upon them. He pleads for mercy. He promises to make whatever amends are required. He is, in these prayers, not a distant and remote king, but a human being in genuine distress, trying to understand why the gods are angry and what can be done to appease them. This same framework would have shaped how the people of the Bronze Age understood the crisis of 1200 BC. The droughts and raids and earthquakes and famines were not random bad luck. They were divine messages, and the appropriate response was not simply material and political adaptation, but religious activity, more intense sacrifices, more earnest prayers, more careful performance of the rituals that maintained the relationship between the human and the divine. The religious archives, from the final period of the palace cultures, where they survive, show evidence of intensified religious activity in the final years, which is consistent with a population that understood its troubles in divine terms and was seeking divine solutions. This framework did not save them. The gods, if they existed, and if they communicated with human beings through drought and earthquake and raid, did not relent. The palaces burned, the cities fell, and in the silence that followed, the religious traditions had to find ways to make sense of what had happened. Some of them did this by intensifying the emphasis on divine sovereignty and human unworthiness, developing theologies in which the calamities of history were not evidence that the gods had abandoned their people, but evidence that the people had failed to honor the gods with sufficient devotion. The prophetic tradition of ancient Israel, for example, which developed in the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse in a region that had been dramatically disrupted by it, interpreted the political calamities of its own time in exactly these terms, as divine punishment for religious infidelity that could be reversed by return to proper relationship with the divine. Other traditions responded differently. The Greek tradition, developing through the Dark Ages, produced in Homer a worldview in which the gods were present and powerful, but also arbitrary and often indifferent to human suffering. Gods who used human beings as pieces in their own games, rather than beings who genuinely cared about human welfare. This vision of the divine, darker and more resigned than the vision of divine partnership that had characterized some of the Bronze Age religious traditions, may reflect in some deep way the experience of the collapse, the sense of having been abandoned, the difficulty of believing in a divine order that had allowed such comprehensive destruction. We cannot know what the last priests of the Ugarit temples thought as the fire approached. We cannot know whether the palace scribes of Pylos prayed to the gods in those final days and what they prayed for. We cannot know how the ordinary farmers and craftsmen and sailors of the late Bronze Age world made sense of the catastrophe that was overtaking them, what stories they told each other to explain what was happening and to maintain the hope that was necessary to keep living in the face of it. We know only that they were human beings, facing the most extreme circumstances with the resources available to them, and that enough of them survived to build a world that, in time, produced the civilizations that we think of as the foundation of our own. Whatever they believed, whatever they hoped for, whatever stories they told, they were not entirely wrong. Things did not get better quickly. The darkness lasted for generations, but eventually, the darkness lifted, and the world rebuilt itself, and the human story continued. That continuation is the most remarkable thing about the Bronze Age collapse, more remarkable even than the scale of the destruction, that the collapse was so comprehensive, so widespread, so devastating in its effects on the material and cultural achievements of the late Bronze Age, and that human beings survived it and eventually rebuilt from it, is a testament to something deep in the human capacity for persistence and adaptation, and the refusal, even in the face of the most extreme circumstances, to simply stop. The Bronze Age world ended, the people did not. And from that persistence, from that refusal of the human to disappear, even when the civilization did, everything that came after was made possible. That is the thought to carry into the dark, if you carry any thought at all. Not a lesson, exactly. Not a prescription for how to face adversity. Just an observation about the nature of things. An observation that the evidence of 3,000 years of human history supports. That the things we build are mortal, and the people who build them are more durable than the things they build. And that the darkness that follows the end of any particular world is not the same as the end of the world. The night is quiet now. The story is told. The Bronze Age has said what it has to say, in all its complexity and its mystery and its extraordinary human reality. The tablets are in their cases. The ruins are in their landscapes. The sea is in its ancient basin, and you are where you are, at whatever hour this finds you, in whatever place, at whatever moment of the night. The ancient world ended a long time ago, and its ending gave rise to the world that gave rise to the world that eventually gave rise to you, listening here, in the particular darkness of your particular night, to the story of people who lived and built and lost everything, and somehow passed enough forward that you are here, thousands of years later, still able to hear about them. That is worth a moment of quiet wonder before sleep comes. The Bronze Age is over. The story is told. And the night, as it always has, holds everything in its patient dark. There is a particular quality to the quiet that comes after a long story. It is not the emptiness of silence before things begin. It is a fullness, a weighted stillness that carries within it everything that has been said. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is like that. When you come to the end of it, you carry something, even if you cannot name exactly what it is. A sense of scale, a sense of how long human beings have been at this particular work, the work of building and losing and rebuilding. A sense of the people behind the evidence, the human beings whose lives the pottery and the tablets and the burned layers only partially capture. There is something else too, something that takes longer to articulate. It has to do with the question of what we owe to the past. We owe the Bronze Age nothing in any legal or practical sense. The people of Ugarit and Pylos and Hattusa cannot be harmed or helped by anything we do or fail to do. They are beyond our reach in every practical sense. And yet there is a kind of obligation that serious engagement with the past creates, an obligation not to let what was built and lost simply disappear into the generic background noise of time. The obligation to look carefully, to try to understand, to resist the comfortable simplification that turns complex historical processes into single-cause stories with clear villains and obvious lessons. The Bronze Age collapse resists simplification. Every time a scholar thinks they have found the definitive cause, the evidence reveals another layer of complexity, another interacting factor, another way in which the simple story was actually not simple at all. The drought was real, but drought alone cannot explain everything. The sea peoples were real, but they too were set in motion by forces larger than themselves. The internal political instabilities were real, but they were also partly responses to external pressures. The complexity of the system was real, but complexity alone does not produce collapse without some triggering stresses. Everything connects to everything else, and the more carefully you look, the more connections you see, until the Bronze Age collapse begins to look less like an event and more like a condition, a state of the world in which the preconditions for catastrophe had been accumulating for decades or longer before they finally converged in the destruction of the palace cities. That is uncomfortable. We want our historical catastrophes to have causes we can point to, decisions that could have been made differently, failures of leadership or foresight that, if corrected, might have changed the outcome. The Bronze Age collapse offers us only limited satisfaction on this front. The climate did what the climate did. The sea peoples went where hunger and displacement drove them. The interconnected system did what complex interconnected systems sometimes do when multiple stresses accumulate beyond their capacity to absorb. The individuals within the system made their decisions, and some of those decisions were better and some were worse. But none of them, even the best of them, could have reversed the systemic forces that were converging on the late Bronze Age world. This is a humbling thought, and it should be. The most sophisticated civilization the Eastern Mediterranean had yet produced could not save itself from the convergence of forces that ended it. Its sophistication, in some ways, made it more vulnerable, not less. The warning lights were on, in the form of the unusual droughts and the unusual raids and the unusual frequency of disrupted trade. But the system did not have the capacity to read those lights as a systemic warning rather than as a series of individual, manageable problems. The palace administrators who were collecting bronze from the temples at Pylos were responding to the problem in front of them, the shortage of bronze for weapons. They were not responding to the Bronze Age collapse because they did not know they were living in the Bronze Age collapse. They were living in what they knew as the present, trying to manage the immediate crisis with the tools available to them. And this, finally, is the most intimate point of connection between the Bronze Age and our own time. Not any structural similarity between their world and ours, not any specific lesson about managing complex systems, but simply the recognition that they were in their present, as we are in ours, unable to see the full shape of what they were part of, responding to immediate pressures with the frameworks and tools available to them, doing their best, and finding, in the end, that their best was not sufficient. We do not know what our end will look like, or if it will come in our time, or in the time of our descendants. We do not know which of the stresses of our own world will prove manageable, and which will prove to be the first threads of an unraveling we cannot yet see the shape of. We live in our present, as they lived in theirs, with incomplete information and limited frameworks, and the constant pressure of the immediate. What we have that they did not have is their story. We have the record of what happened to them, partial and fragmented, and still being assembled but real. We have the evidence of the Bronze Age collapse. We can look at it and study it and understand something of what happened and why. And if that understanding does not give us the certainty or the control we might wish for, it at least gives us a kind of company in our uncertainty. The knowledge that other people, in other times, faced the limits of what even their best efforts could achieve, and that the world went on, changed and smaller and poorer for a while, but alive, and eventually rebuilt. That is the gift the Bronze Age collapse gives us, 3,000 years after the fact. Not answers, not lessons in any simple form, but company and honesty, and the long view that helps us hold our own moment with something closer to appropriate proportion. Rest now. The ancient world has earned its silence, and so have you. The story will still be here in the morning, still incomplete, still mysterious, still worth returning to. The Bronze Age is patient. It has waited 3,000 years to be heard. It can wait a little longer. Sleep well, but before the silence comes entirely, one last thing. One final image to carry with you into whatever sleep is coming. Imagine a night in Ugarit, in the years before the end. The city is still whole. The harbour is quiet. The merchant ships are resting at their moorings, their hulls dark against the darker water. The workshops are closed and dark. The palace is lit in a few of its windows, where perhaps a scribe is working late on a tablet that will not survive the century, or a guard is making his rounds of the corridors. The great temple on the hill catches the moonlight on its stones. In the residential quarters, people are asleep. The merchants who have spent the day negotiating the price of copper, the craftsmen whose hands still smell of the materials they have been working, the sailors who will leave on the morning tide, the scribes who have been recording the flow of goods and people through a city at the center of the world's trade, the children who will grow up in this city and not know that it will not survive their lifetimes, all of them sleeping, as people have always slept, trusting that the world will be recognizable in the morning. The sea is breathing at the edge of the city. The stars are out, the same stars that are out tonight wherever you are, the same stars that were out over the destroyed cities and the burned palaces and the empty ruins of the Bronze Age, enduring as they always have through everything that happened beneath them. The people of Ugarit slept under those stars. You are sleeping under those stars tonight. The distance between you and them is enormous, measured in time and culture and material circumstance, and it is also, in some sense, nothing at all. The dark, the quiet, the body releasing its hold on the day, the mind drifting toward the loose-limbed country of sleep. These things were the same for them as they are for you. Will always be the same. The Bronze Age is over. The night is not. Sleep well, and if the night is long enough, and the story has not yet done its work, here is one more thing to hold. The archaeologists who excavated Ugarit, who excavated Pylos, who excavated Hattusa, were themselves people who spent their working lives in intimate relationship with a world that ended 3,000 years before they were born. They dug in the ground, and they found the evidence, and they translated the tablets, and they wrote the papers and the books that have allowed the rest of us to know what they found. Many of them devoted decades to this work. Some of them spent their entire careers at a single site, year after year, uncovering layer after layer of a world that had been waiting in the ground for their attention. There is something quietly extraordinary about that devotion. To give a life to understanding a world that ended before your civilization existed is a particular kind of dedication, not to power or profit or fame, though some of these scholars achieved a modest version of all of those things, but to understanding, to the insistence that the past deserves to be known as fully and as accurately as the evidence will allow. The people who did this work gave us the Bronze Age back, or as much of it as can be given back, and that is a gift that we should not take lightly. The tablets of Ugarit were found by a scholar's patience. The Linear B script was cracked by a scholar's insight. The connection between Bronze Age climate and Bronze Age collapse was made by scientists who spent years analyzing lake sediments and cave formations, looking for patterns in the chemical record of the ancient world. The story we have been telling tonight is the product of all of that work, and behind all of that work are the individual human beings who did it, who brought their intelligence and their curiosity and their sustained attention to the evidence of a world that ended a very long time ago. That chain of attention, stretching from the moment the first shovel broke the soil at a Bronze Age site to the moment these words reach you in the dark of your particular night, is itself a remarkable human achievement. Quiet and scholarly, and not particularly dramatic, but real and valuable. and worthy of acknowledgement. The Bronze Age does not speak for itself. It needs the people who learned its languages and decoded its scripts and analyzed its pottery and read its chemistry to translate it for the rest of us. And those people gave that translation freely, out of the conviction that the past is worth knowing and that human beings deserve to understand as much as they can about the long story they are part of. That is the final thought before sleep comes. You are part of a long story, longer than you can easily hold in your mind, longer than any single telling can capture. The Bronze Age is one chapter of that story, a chapter that ended badly and was followed by darkness before the next chapter began. And here you are, in a chapter that is your own, carrying within you, without knowing it, the long inheritance of everything that came before. Sleep now. The story goes on, as it always has, whether or not we are awake to follow it.